Murder at the Seaside, a 1920s Cosy Mystery, a Tommy and Evelyn Christie mystery, Book 8. Written by Catherine Coles, narrated by Alex Lee. Chapter 1. Scarborough, North Yorkshire, July 1923. "How are you finding Scarborough, Lady Northmore?" Lady Caroline Merriweather asked. "It's almost too relaxing." Tommy Christie, Earl of Northmore, watched as his wife Evelyn put a hand over her mouth to hide a yawn. "It certainly isn't a bit like our last holiday, is it, darling?" "Goodness me, no," he laughed, and turned back to Lady Caroline, who had arrived at the seaside resort a couple of days earlier and almost immediately latched on to his great-aunt. "I'd had the brilliant idea of taking my aunt and my wife to India. That sounds a positively glorious experience." Lady Caroline frowned. "I can't imagine what could have gone wrong." "It all started when we set off," Evelyn said. "Unbeknownst to Tommy, I was in a delicate condition." Tommy smiled adoringly at his wife. "I was not aware of Evelyn's condition when I booked the trip. Poor Evelyn was horribly ill all the way to India." "I struggled to leave our suite," she said, and Tommy grimaced as he recalled exactly how bilious the trip across the sea had made her. "Were you still unwell when you reached firm ground?" "I'm afraid so." Evelyn sipped her tea. "My husband and Aunt Em went off exploring by themselves on the first day, leaving me behind to recover my strength. And when we returned," Aunt Em continued the story, "it was to find there had been a murder, and Lady Northmore herself was one of the suspects." "Oh, good gracious!" Lady Caroline's eyes widened. "How perfectly dreadful! Do tell me what happened next." "Ordinarily, in those sorts of circumstances, Tommy and I would do a little sleuthing," Evelyn said humbly. "We have been fortunate in the past to solve a few cases." "I had forgotten about that." Lady Caroline's mouth formed a perfect circle. The hand containing her teacup paused halfway from the saucer to her mouth. "The famous Northmore investigators. They are exceedingly well known," Aunt Em bragged. "My great-nephew and his wife receive correspondence regularly, simply begging them to solve crimes." Tommy considered his aunt's words not entirely accurate. To date, they had received 3 letters asking for help. One was from a lady who appeared elderly and wanted to track her fiancé, whom she hadn't seen since before the Boer War. Another was from a gentleman in Brighton who believed the spirits of the Bronte siblings occupied his house. The last note was from Ireland and asked for their help in tracking down missing family jewellery. "Were you thrown in jail, Lady Northmore?" "Fortunately not." Evelyn picked up a perfectly cut triangular-shaped sandwich. "Lady Emily and my husband worked diligently to solve the crime before it came to that." Aunt Em reached out and patted Evelyn's hand. "You did your share, dear." "Tell us more about yourself, Lady Caroline," Tommy said. "I understand you have known my great-aunt for some years." She waved a hand. "More than we both care to remember, I am sure." "I believe it was around the First Boer War." Aunt Em tapped a finger against her chin. Her mind was usually sharper than a rapier, so it wouldn't be long before she recalled the precise occasion. "You stopped receiving visitors." Lady Caroline stared morosely into her empty cup. "That was when I lost Charles." "You went into mourning," Aunt Em said with feeling. "I did." Lady Caroline stared across the road towards the sea. "For an exceedingly long time, life lost its fun for me. Fortunately, my children reminded me every day that I needed to go on." "Your children were young when they lost their father," Aunt Em commented, "with very pretty names, if I recall correctly." Lady Caroline smiled. "That's very kind of you to say so. Iris and Violet are wonderful girls. I do hope you don't see it as crass to praise one's own children." Of course, they now have grown children of their own. Tommy wondered what had happened to the family title if Lady Caroline's only children were girls. Had it died with their father, or was it owned by some other long-lost family member? Perhaps that also explained Lady Caroline's retreat from society. She wouldn't be the first gentlewoman to find herself in difficulties financially following the loss of her spouse. It wasn't the first time the ridiculous and archaic system of hereditary titles bothered him. Since he himself had inherited his title in the family home, Heselham Hall, he had felt the unspoken pressure of producing an heir. However, now that Evelyn was close to giving birth, he found himself completely indifferent to whether the baby was a boy or a girl. All he cared about was that Evelyn and his child were healthy. "How time passes," Aunt Em said, as a faraway look came into her eyes. "You should make sure you treasure every moment with your child when it arrives." Lady Caroline looked directly at Evelyn. Over 8 years of marriage told him his wife felt extremely uncomfortable at the intensity of Lady Caroline's gaze, though she answered with her usual graciousness, "You can be certain that I shall." "Do tell me, Lord Northmore." Lady Caroline leaned forward, as though about to impart a secret. "Who is the exceedingly attractive man in your party?" "I am certain that the fellow you refer to is the Earl of Chesden," he said. "He is engaged to be married to my eldest sister, Constance." "I do so love a wedding. Are the nuptials due to take place soon?" He couldn't help the frown that puckered his brow. "My sister favours an autumn wedding." "You don't approve?" "It isn't that we don't approve," Evelyn said. "Simply that it's all rather sudden, and we haven't had an opportunity of getting to know the Earl very well." "We didn't know his friend before he married Elise, and that's worked out rather well." Aunt Em looked at Lady Caroline shrewdly. "Elise is Tommy's cousin, and married to the Earl of Clifford." "Goodness!" Lady Caroline lifted her fan and flapped ineffectually at the warm, still air. "Wasn't his father involved in some sort of terrible scandal?" Tommy glanced quickly at his great-aunt, as he realized the older woman was deliberately naming their titled relatives and friends. Aunt Em was a lot of things, but ostentatious wasn't one of them. Was it possible she was testing the veracity of Lady Caroline's sudden and intense friendship? It wouldn't be the first time someone had tried to befriend the Christie family because of their connections. Was Caroline Merriweather one of those? Or did she remember her friendship with Aunt Em fondly? "Mrs. Benson, isn't it?" Evelyn asked, as she approached a woman who appeared to be a similar age to herself. The woman swallowed nervously. "It is, Lady Northmore. I'm so very pleased to make your acquaintance." Evelyn nodded at the younger woman sitting with Mrs. Benson. "Won't you and your sister-in-law come and join us, while the men take port and smoke their ghastly cigars?" "Oh, we couldn't." Mrs. Benson shook her head. "It wouldn't be right." "Nonsense," Evelyn said firmly. "What wouldn't be right is for you two to sit here alone when you can sit and chat with us. If you're certain it wouldn't be an imposition, how could we refuse?" Evelyn smiled brightly at the red-haired woman and leaned closer. "I do hope you won't regret your decision. My sister-in-law is regaling everyone with plans for her wedding. Constance is planning the biggest and best wedding Ireland has ever seen." "Ireland?" Ruth Benson raised an inquiring eyebrow. "I should love to see Ireland, but my husband Archie tells me the weather is quite inclement." "It could rain every single day, but I don't think Constance would notice. She's so very much in love." "That's positively delightful," Ruth replied with a genuine smile. "How wonderful it is to see young people marry for love and not for some misplaced sense of duty." Evelyn couldn't help but wonder if that had been the case for Ruth and her husband. She had noticed none of the little signs that theirs was a love match. Tommy would chastise her for jumping to conclusions and remind her that not everyone was comfortable showing their feelings in public. "I completely agree," Evelyn said. "I am pleased to report that the Earl of Cheston is every bit as besotted with Constance as she is with him. My husband, however, is yet to be convinced. As is to be expected, he is very protective of both of his sisters." Ruth's eyes flicked to the Christie group across the room and then down to the floor. "Indeed, yes. Is there something amiss, Mrs. Benson?" "Not at all," the woman replied, but Evelyn wasn't to be deterred. "Please, speak freely," Evelyn implored, "particularly if it has something to do with my family." "It's probably nothing at all," Ruth said quickly. "Why don't you tell me? Perhaps it will relieve your burden to share what you know." Ruth looked back over at Evelyn's friends and family. Her gaze seemed to be aimed at Tommy's youngest sister. "It's just that I saw Miss Grace talking with the hotel manager this morning." Evelyn tried to think of a reason the young girl would have to address to the manager of the Majestic, but she couldn't think of a single one. They had brought their nursemaid with them to care for Madeline and David's infant daughter Josephine, and it was Elsie who liaised directly with the hotel staff. "That is a little unusual," Evelyn agreed. "But perhaps she had a particular request to make of him?" Ruth looked down at the table, and her cheeks flushed. "Perhaps I should make myself clear." Evelyn took a seat opposite Mrs. Benson and glanced at Mabel Benson, who was yet to utter a word. "Please do." "I am not usually an inquisitive person, but on this occasion, I'm afraid I dallied to watch what transpired." Evelyn wanted to prod the woman into talking plainly about what she had seen instead of procrastinating. "I'm sure that is true. And what did you see?" "It was because he was standing so close to her, you see," Ruth explained. "That's why I didn't move away. He seemed rather too familiar in my eyes." "We are talking about Mr. Williamson, the hotel manager," Evelyn clarified. "Yes. Oh, Lady Northmore." Ruth raised both hands to cover her burning cheeks. "When he finished whispering in her ear, he kissed her." Mabel Benson gasped and looked at her sister-in-law in horror. "The hotel manager kissed Grace?" Evelyn repeated, unable to hide her shock. She wasn't sure what she was expecting to hear, but it certainly hadn't been that. Grace loved to read romantic novels, but she wasn't as outgoing and confident as her sister. In fact, Tommy's youngest sister was rather shy. "Are you quite all right, dear?" Ruth asked Mabel, then turned to Evelyn. "I'm very sorry, Lady Northmore. It isn't nothing at all, is it?" "It most certainly is not." Evelyn pressed her lips together in a grim line. "It is most unseemly. I would be grateful if you can confirm for me where he kissed her." Ruth Benson flushed again, and Evelyn knew the answer before the other woman spoke. "It was directly on the mouth, my lady. Lord Northmore will be furious." Evelyn tapped her finger on the table. "Can we agree that we should not tell him just yet? Does your husband know?" "It isn't the sort of thing I would talk to Archie about. I can assure you I will not betray your confidence." "Good. That is very good. I shall deal with this myself. We were rather hoping to make this month-long family trip to the Seaside an annual event, but we cannot stay here, or indeed plan to return while that scoundrel remains the manager. How dare he presume to lay hands on Grace?" "I apologize that my words have caused you such distress, Lady Northmore." Evelyn had never been a snob, but here she was, espousing that a hotel manager was not good enough for her sister-in-law. Not everyone could marry a titled fellow, and nor should they. A troubling thought occurred to her. Was it possible Grace believed herself to be in love with the fellow? Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Benson. I appreciate your honesty and discretion more than you can know. Evelyn smiled at the other woman. Now, please, tell me this. How did Grace react to Mr. Williamson's impertinence? She held her hands to her cheeks, as though she was quite overcome, Ruth explained. I don't think she could believe he had been so bold. Neither could she. And then? Why, the young lady ran hurriedly away, without speaking another word to him. That didn't really inform her one way or the other whether Grace welcomed Mr. Williamson's attentions. Where did this encounter take place? In the hotel gardens this morning, Ruth said. I was taking a walk and I heard voices. I confess I was a little curious, as though speaking were out of view, as though they were hiding, you understand. So I took a peek. And then it was impossible to look away. Quite. Evelyn got back to her feet. I'm very grateful, Mrs. Benson. Now, let us join the others before they wonder what we are talking about so earnestly. Tommy headed up the stairs to their suite of rooms, one step behind his wife. She seemed a little quiet and looked rather weary when he rejoined the women after dinner. However, he had been married long enough to know that wasn't the sort of thing a gentleman said to one's wife. Evelyn paused at the door to the room that was being used as a nursery for Josephine, who was now an active and happy little girl of 15 months. Do let us stop in, Tommy. He smiled indulgently at his wife. If we wake her, I don't know who will be most annoyed with us. I believe it'll be my wife. Tommy turned to see David Ryder. I can never resist one more look at her before going to sleep, Madeline, Tommy's cousin, confessed. She sleeps so soundly. She won't wake unless someone is too loud. The look she gave her husband told Tommy that there had been at least one occasion when David had woken his stepdaughter, then suffered his wife's ire. It was one occasion, David held up his hands. A mistake I never intend to repeat, of course. Come along. Madeline turned the doorknob and quietly pushed open the door. Her loud gasp told Tommy something was dreadfully wrong even before he entered the room. No, David called stridently. This cannot be right. Now, Evelyn said calmly, things may not be as they seem. Do not rush to conclusions and cause yourself unnecessary upset, Madeline. Tommy looked around the nursery. A lamp lay on its side next to the armchair in the corner of the room. On the floor, next to the chair, was a book as though Elsie, the nursemaid, had been reading before being disturbed. The window to the left of the door to the balcony was broken, glass scattered on the red-patterned carpet. However, most horrifying of all, the crib was empty. Chapter 2. Where is she? Madeline wailed, as David rushed around the room, searching in the most ridiculous places for the baby. Under the crib, in the wardrobe, before pushing open the door to the adjoining room to their own suite. She's not here, he called. Hot tears ran down Evelyn's face as she cradled her belly. We'll find her, Tommy said grimly. Don't worry, she can't have got far. Someone has taken her, Madeline cried. I just knew it. Look at the room. What other explanation could there possibly be? Evelyn didn't want to think about who had taken Josephine and why, but she agreed with Madeline's assessment of the situation. She pointed at the bed in the corner of the nursery where the nursemaid slept. Elsie is missing too. Perhaps Josephine wouldn't settle, and Elsie has taken her for a walk along the seafront to help her sleep, Tommy suggested. Hope stopped Madeline's tears as she turned to David. I suppose that's possible, isn't it? I'll go downstairs and see if anyone has seen Elsie or Josephine since dinner. David's voice was frantic as he rushed from the room. Evelyn put an arm around Madeline's shaking shoulders and watched as Tommy paced the room, as he was apt to do when feeling frustrated. Although his suggestion, which had calmed Madeline a touch, was plausible, she knew he didn't believe it was a genuine possibility. The baby's carriage stood near the door to the corridor. It was most unlikely Elsie would have taken the toddler anywhere without it. "Perhaps your mother has her," Evelyn suggested. "Aunt Victoria was still downstairs when we came up," Tommy said. "This makes no sense," Madeline said between sobs. "Who would want to take my baby?" Running feet sounded in the corridor, and David returned to the room with the hotel manager, Harold Williamson. Although there were more critical matters at hand, Evelyn couldn't help but look at the manager in the light of the information Ruth Benson had shared with her after dinner. It reminded her she still needed to speak to Grace about the intimate moment the girl had shared with the man. She supposed he was quite handsome, and it was impossible to fault his manner. He had been extremely deferential towards the family since their arrival 3 weeks ago at the Scarborough Hotel he managed. Nothing had been too much trouble for him or his staff to arrange. "How may I be of assistance, Lord Northmore?" Harold addressed Tommy and gave a deferential bow. "What a terrible thing to happen at the Majestic. I can assure you nothing like this has ever happened before. I wish to assure you that my staff and I are at your complete disposal. We will do whatever we can to help you recover the child." Tommy nodded towards David, who now held his devastated wife in his arms. "We appreciate your concern. As you can see, Josephine's parents are completely distraught." "Mr. Ryder," the manager said earnestly, "I repeat what I've just said. Nothing is too much trouble. Please, tell me where we can begin helping you find your daughter." "Is it possible for someone to climb up the outside of the hotel?" David asked, indicating the broken window. "Could someone scale the walls, pull themselves up onto the balcony, and then break into the room that way?" Harold looked down at the carpet. "I really don't think that is possible, sir. However, I shall send someone out immediately to see if there is any evidence of what you suggest has taken place." He moved over to the hallway and spoke rapidly to someone outside the door. Evelyn heard muffled footsteps hurrying off down the corridor. "Have you telephoned for the police, Mr. Williamson?" "Not as yet, Lady Northmore. When Mr. Ryder informed me of the situation, I thought it best to come straight upstairs and see what I could do." "Do you not think, now you have seen the condition of the nursery, that they should be called immediately?" I thought," he stammered. "That is, I hoped we could resolve this issue without involving them." "Did you indeed?" she snapped, not liking the man's attitude. Was it possible he cared more about the hotel's reputation and less about a missing child? "Unless you think it possible that a 15-month-old child can climb out of her crib, break a window, knock over a lamp, lose her nanny, and then somehow disappear all by herself, I think this is most certainly a situation where the police should be called. In fact, I insist you do it immediately." On previous occasions, the family had met Detective Inspector Andrews, a senior detective from York. Although he wasn't the sharpest, he was still a police officer, and as such, had access to techniques they did not, such as fingerprinting and an entire constabulary of men who could track down Josephine and Elsie. "Do you really think that's necessary?" Madeline turned watery eyes towards her. "Perhaps Josephine woke and Elsie's just taken her for a walk. That is possible, isn't it?" Evelyn looked away as Madeline looked imploringly at her husband. The devastation on the other woman's face was so raw, it hurt to look at her. She couldn't imagine how she would feel if any harm were to come to her own child. David did not answer his wife, but pulled her more tightly into his embrace. "Lady Northmore is right. Please see to it immediately, Mr. Williamson." The manager nodded and left the room. Evelyn moved over to stand next to Tommy, hoping his strength and unfailing optimism would flow into her. She had rarely felt as hopeless as she did at that moment. As the room fell silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts, a tapping sound came from the direction of the balcony. Tommy stared at the doors in disbelief before rushing over, pulling back the thick red curtains and throwing open the double doors. On the tiled floor was Josephine's nursemaid, Elsie Warren. Her hands were bound in front of her body with what looked like the type of twine used to tie parcels. She had clearly used her feet to knock on the glass of the balcony door to draw attention to herself. David rushed over and helped Tommy lift Elsie to her feet. "Miss Warren, are you injured?" "No, Lord Northmore, I am not," she said, her voice trembling. "Where is Josephine? Where is my baby?" Madeline asked, before burying her head in her husband's chest, her shoulders racked with renewed sobs. "Oh, Mrs. Ryder, it was dreadful. I did try." Elsie covered her face with her hands. "Oh, please. I'd struggled with the fiend and tried to stop him from taking Josephine, but he hit me and I fell to the floor." "He hit you?" Evelyn repeated. "Where did he hit you?" "Straight across the face," Elsie responded. "Then he tied my hands and threw me out onto the balcony. I think I must have blacked out then." "The hotel manager has telephoned for the police," Tommy said briskly. "They will want a full description of the man who hit you and took Josephine, as well as an account of precisely what happened. Do you think you can do that?" "Of course, Lord Northmore." Elsie dipped her head as she often did when she spoke directly to Tommy. Evelyn was never quite sure if it was deferential or because she was in awe of him. Her husband was a jolly handsome man. Mr. Williamson returned to the room. "The police are on their way." "Good," Tommy nodded. "That's very good. Thank you. Now, Miss Warren, you must tell us everything you know before they get here." "I thought you wanted me to tell the police," she said, a look of confusion clouding her pretty face. "I most certainly do," he replied, "but I want you to tell me first." "Perhaps you could arrange for the rest of the family to be told what has transpired," Evelyn addressed the hotel manager. "And arrange for a tray of tea to be brought to us. Mrs. Ryder and Miss Warren have both had a terrible shock." "I shall send someone to do that immediately." He moved over to the door. Evelyn followed him. "Thank you, Mr. Williamson. That will be all we require of you at this time." She closed the door behind the hotel manager, leaving him in the corridor with a bemused look decorating his face. "Now, Madeline," Tommy said gently, "do you want to stay in the room while we talk to Elsie, or do you think it will be too distressing for you?" Madeline lifted her head from David's shoulder and looked indignantly at Tommy. "Of course I want to stay. What a ridiculous question. I am not so delicate that I don't want to hear everything I possibly can about what led to the disappearance of my child." "Sit down, Miss Warren," Tommy encouraged the nursemaid, indicating the armchair near the broken window. She bent forward, as though to pick up the book on the floor. "Don't touch that." "Oh, Lord Northmore." Elsie turned frightened eyes to Tommy. "You mustn't touch anything in the room. As much as we possibly can, we must leave this room exactly as we found it. It will help the police do their job properly." "Of course," she smiled, appeased by his softer tone. "Sometimes I forget you're so knowledgeable about the ways of the police." Tommy ignored her flattery. "Let's go to the very beginning. Tell me exactly what happened, from the moment Mr. and Mrs. Ryder went down for dinner and left Josephine in your care." Elsie's eyebrows puckered. "Yes, now let me see. Mrs. Ryder kissed Josephine and placed her in the crib to sleep. I sat in this chair right here as I always do when Josephine is taking a nap or retiring for the evening. I think I must have fallen asleep because—" "Now, let us be clear," Tommy said, with a hint of steel threaded through his words. "We must have all the information. Leaving out even a small part, however insignificant you may think it is, could prevent us from finding out what has happened here." "Well, Lord Northmore, I don't believe I have left anything out." "Think, Miss Warren," he encouraged. "Mrs. Ryder left the room, leaving you in here alone with Josephine. Was the lamp turned on when she left?" "I don't recall." Elsie stared at the lamp, which lay on its side near her feet, as though it may have the answer she did not. Tommy swallowed down his irritation and tried again. "Who turned off the overhead light?" "Mrs. Ryder did that as she left the room. Elsie pointed at the door. "The light switch is over there, you see." He had to remind himself that not everyone was observant. He had learned to take notice of his surroundings when he worked in the police force. During the war, he was even more vigilant. It wasn't Elsie's fault that she'd had a terrible shock and could not remember every single detail correctly. "Were you reading before you fell asleep?" "Yes," she nodded enthusiastically. "I see now. That's very clever, Lord Northmore. The lamp must have been on. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to see to read when Mrs. Ryder turned off the main light." It may well be the middle of summer, but with the heavy red drapes covering the windows and the door to the balcony, the room would have been very dark indeed without the small light of the lamp. "What awoke you?" "The shattering of the window, Lord Northmore." Elsie shuddered as she recollected the event. "I was that scared. I'm so surprised nobody else heard it. I thought the entire building was coming down around my ears, or the sea had somehow come over the wall and we were all about to drown." "Now, Elsie, that's quite enough." Evelyn shook her head but gave the nursemaid a kindly smile. "Let us not embellish what occurred. It's very important that we just stick to the facts. The faster we know them, the quicker we can start our search for Josephine. Do you understand?" "Yes, Lady Northmore," Elsie answered meekly. "So, the window had been broken," Tommy recapped. "What happened next?" "A man burst in through the doors and hit me." "While you were sitting in the armchair?" "No." Elsie held up a hand. No, wait. I got to my feet. I was shocked, of course, but my first thoughts were of protecting Josephine. I jumped up and approached the man. It was then that he slapped me hard across the face and I fell to the floor." "Oh, you poor dear," Evelyn said. "How very brave you were." "Thank you, Lady Northmore." Elsie dipped her head modestly. "It was then he leaned across me, grabbed my hands, and tied them together."
"Did he say anything to you?" Tommy asked.
"Not a single word," Elsie confirmed. "Just tied me up and threw me onto the balcony, like I was a sack of rubbish, as though I was of no importance to him whatsoever." "You must be very sore," Evelyn commented. Elsie turned to Evelyn with a frown on her face. Oh, of course. Yes, very sore, from where I landed on the stone floor of the balcony. I expect I shall be black and blue by morning."
"Quite," Tommy said. "You have been treated abominably. What do you remember next?"
"I can't tell you any more," Elsie shrugged. "After he put me on the balcony, he shut the door. I couldn't hear anything. I couldn't see anything.
There was something not quite right with Elsie's story, but Tommy couldn't put his finger on what it was. It all seemed very plausible, yet he couldn't help thinking he was missing something that mattered very much. A soft knock sounded on the door and David hurried over to open it. He turned round to face the room. "It's just the tea tray." He brought it into the room and placed it on the table next to the armchair. Elsie immediately got to her feet and started arranging the cups and saucers. Evelyn put her hand on the girl's shoulder and gently pushed her back down into the chair. "You must rest. You've had a quite terrible shock. Sit down, and I shall pour tea for us."
"Lady Northmore, I couldn't let you do that. It would be a quite dreadful dereliction of my duties."
Evelyn raised an eyebrow at the young woman's words, and Tommy could understand why. They didn't seem like the sort of thing a nursemaid would say. Goodness only knew what the girl had been reading in the book that had fallen to the floor. He made a mental note to look at the title before they left the room. "Think carefully, Miss Warren." Tommy passed a cup of tea loaded with sugar to Elsie. "Is there anything else that happened you have not yet told us? It is important that you're very clear on what you saw and heard, so that you can tell the police everything when they arrive." Elsie blew on her hot drink and took a cautious sip.
"I've had a good think, Lord Northmore. There's nothing more I can tell you. I only wish that there was. I would do or say anything if it meant we could locate Josephine. You all know how much I adore that child." "Yes, Elsie," Madeline said quickly. "We know how excellent your care of Josephine is."
"We are very grateful," David added. You did your utmost to protect our darling girl. Lady Northmore is correct, you were brave. Very brave indeed. We thank you wholeheartedly, and we're so sorry for your distress and your injuries."
Elsie inclined her head. "Thank you, Mr. Ryder."
"If that is all, perhaps we should now clear the room," Tommy suggested. "The police will be here soon and certainly won't want to see us trampling all over it when they arrive. Miss Warren, bring your tea. You must come with us to our suite." David supported his wife through to their bedroom, which adjoined the nursery, while Tommy held open the main door to the corridor for the ladies. When Evelyn and Elsie were settled in the armchairs in their suite, Tommy excused himself to go downstairs to speak to the hotel manager and await the arrival of the police.
"How have you found your stay at the Majestic Hotel over the last 3 weeks?" Evelyn asked. "I'm not quite sure what you want me to say, Lady Northmore. I just want you to tell me the truth." Evelyn sipped the lukewarm tea. It was better than nothing. "Whatever you can tell me may be useful in tracking down who has taken Josephine." "It's a beautiful place to stay." Elsie looked to Evelyn for approval. "Yes, it is," Evelyn agreed. "I'm looking for more information about the people here." "Do you mean the hotel staff?" "Everyone," Evelyn clarified. "The staff, the guests, anyone who may come in for afternoon tea, actually." She smiled, hoping it would encourage Elsie to speak honestly about anything she may have noticed. "I suppose you mean people that have taken notice of Josephine?" Elsie asked. "Anything, really," Evelyn said. "But yes, particularly in relation to Josephine." "That couple that doesn't have any children of their own," Elsie began, blinked a few times as though trying to recall something, then snapped her fingers. "That's it. The Bensons. They don't have children of their own, do they? I would often see Mrs. Benson when I was walking Josephine along the seafront in her pram. She always commented on how beautiful Josephine was. Every single time I saw her. She was very taken with Miss Josephine." "You saw her every day?" "She admired Miss Josephine every day that I saw her," Elsie clarified. "She even said how lucky Mr. and Mrs. Ryder were to have such a delightful child. Isn't that a strange thing for a lady of Mrs. Benson's class to say?" It was a little odd, though Josephine was a particularly delightful child. Perhaps Mrs. Benson simply couldn't help but verbalize that. Evelyn remembered only too well the long years after the war when she and Tommy had remained childless, and that gave her a large measure of sympathy for Mrs. Benson. Perhaps she was in a similar situation herself. "Has anyone else said something similar?" "Well, yes," Elsie said reluctantly. "I wasn't really sure whether I should say. It doesn't seem very kind of me." "Elsie," Evelyn said sternly, "you must remember what Lord Northmore said to you. Anything you can tell us may help. You may not think it is of particular importance, but you must allow us to decide that." "Of course, my lady. It's just that the maid, Nellie, who cleans the rooms on our floor, often chats while she's working." "And comments about Josephine?" "Well, not exactly," Elsie replied. "What exactly do you mean?" Evelyn put down her teacup with rather more force than she had intended. It clinked noisily against the saucer, causing Elsie to start. She felt sorry for the nursemaid, but she was more than a little exasperated at having to drag every single detail out of the reluctant witness. "She was rather disparaging about the family," Elsie said. "That is, she made a few comments about how Josephine would never have to work in her life, while she herself worked terribly hard to support her family." "Oh dear," Evelyn said. "That isn't awfully pleasant, but I do hope you remain loyal to the family, Elsie." "Of course, my lady. You know that I'm ever so grateful for the chance that you gave me." Evelyn certainly hoped the young woman was thankful. They had given her a job at Hesselham Hall after a nasty incident 18 months ago, when Elsie had been taken advantage of by an older married man in the village. "Do you think she could have something to do with Josephine's disappearance?"
I'm certain that isn't the case, Elsie said. Perhaps I shouldn't have said anything. Nellie works very hard, and she was only a little rude about the family. That doesn't mean she would then kidnap a child, does it? It might, Evelyn said, especially if she thought she might then be in a position to extract money from the family in exchange for Josephine's safe return. Do you really think someone has taken Miss Josephine, and the dreadful perpetrator will demand a ransom for her return? It occurred to Evelyn how unusual Elsie's words were. They sounded more like they had come from the pages of a novel than the mouth of a nursemaid. Sadly, Evelyn said, I think that's entirely possible. Chapter 3. The following morning, nothing had changed, which meant they were no closer to finding Josephine. Tommy had spent most of the night pacing in his own room, so he did not disturb Evelyn, who had eventually fallen asleep a little after 2. He finally gave up and went downstairs, as the hotel was waking for the day. Everywhere he looked, staff were rushing here and there, carrying out their duties, polishing furniture, cleaning carpets, arranging fresh flowers. After inquiring at the front desk, he walked outside to wait for the maid Nellie to arrive. As he sat on the bench outside the hotel, he almost wished he'd left this particular suspect for Evelyn. She was so much better with staff than he was. He felt a little stiff and awkward. He still wasn't comfortable with his position as Lord Northmore and the deferential way people spoke to him. Evelyn had taken to her role with her usual aplomb, and she seemed able to create positive relationships with most people, irrespective of their station in life. He envied her easygoing and sunny personality. "Excuse me, might you be the maid Nellie?" Tommy asked as he got to his feet and approached a tired-looking woman walking up the path towards the hotel. Her look could only be described as insolent, but her voice was rigidly polite. "I am Mrs. Eleanor Gregory, and I am a maid here at the Majestic." Tommy inclined his head. "Mrs. Gregory, my apologies. I'm afraid I was only given your name as Nellie." "Well, that is my name." She regarded him as though she were waiting for something else. "How can I help you, Lord Northmore? I'm not sure if you were aware of the incident that occurred late last night here at the hotel." "Incident?" She quirked an eyebrow. "If it was after I left for the day, then I wouldn't know anything about it. I thought perhaps you may have a friend who also works here that may have told you what happened." "I need this job," she said, "but that doesn't mean that I care what happens here when I'm not. The last thing I want to talk about when my shift is over is this hotel." "I see," Tommy said. "Then it is with regret that I must inform you that my cousin's daughter was kidnapped last night." "I am very sorry to hear that," Nellie replied, and she looked genuinely regretful at the news. "But I don't even know who that is." Tommy rubbed a hand over his jaw, belatedly realizing that he had not shaved that morning, and because he hadn't slept, he must look a terrible sight. "I'm sorry. Mrs. Ryder's daughter, Josephine. I believe you have often passed the time of day with her nanny, Elsie Warren." "Miss Josephine is missing?" Nellie covered her mouth with her hand. "How awful!" She was saying the right words, and it certainly appeared that the kidnapping was a shock to her. But there was something else, a heightened colour to her cheeks that increased the more he looked at her. "I don't wish to cause offence, but is it possible you know something about what happened?" "I most certainly do not," Nellie snapped. "Why do people of your class always suspect people of my class when something criminal happens?" "I'm sorry if that's the impression that I gave. It certainly wasn't my intention." He raised a hand and waved it in her direction. "However, you have a very expressive face, and I can tell there is something." "I don't know anything about the kidnap of that poor little girl," she insisted. "Ah," Tommy said as a thought occurred to him. "It isn't that you know something, but rather you're bothered by the conversations you have had with the child's nanny." Nellie pursed her lips together and looked at the hotel. "I don't know what you mean. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must get inside. I can't afford to have my wages docked for being late." "They know you are speaking to me," he said. "In fact, if you tell me everything that you know, I shall give you an entire week's wage." She shook her head, her face now bright red. "I would not take your money." "What is wrong with my money?" Tommy asked in confusion. "I don't work for you. I work for the hotel." "Yes, I know that." He indicated the bench. "Please, can we sit down and talk? I simply want to find my niece." "Lord Northmore," she said haughtily, "you may have a grand title and more money than a whole family can spend in an entire lifetime, but I do not have to do what you say." "Please," he beseeched her. "I don't want to go back inside and admit to my family that I have learned nothing new. Forget who I am, forget our money, and just look at me as a man who wishes to find his cousin's missing child." She gave a short, sharp nod. "You sit down if you want, but I shall stand. You look rather like you might collapse from exhaustion at any moment. Please tell me about your conversations with our nanny. Is she all right? Elsie, I mean. I'm afraid the kidnapper struck her and was quite rough with her. She's rather shocked, as one might expect, but she appears relatively unharmed." "She seems a nice enough sort," Nellie said. "Likes a chinwag." "Yes, I'm sure," Tommy answered in what he hoped was an encouraging voice. "She told us a lot last night." Again, Nellie's face flushed. "Then she's told you what I've said, and that's why you're talking to me this morning. You do think I'm involved?" "We're talking to everyone. Isn't that the police's job? They were here last night. As far as I am aware, the uniformed officers are still out searching for Josephine. The detectives will be back this morning, I'm sure. All I said to her is what I've just said to you. You're a rich lot. You don't have to work a day in your life, and you still can never spend all your money. I just said how life wasn't fair. I have to work hard to support my family because my husband's army pension barely covers food for the children." Tommy immediately felt sympathy for the woman, despite her combative stance and the words that she had delivered in a flat voice. "You lost your husband in the war?" "What do you care?" "I served in the war too." She gave a dry, hard laugh. "Not in the same way as my husband did." "Yes," he said quietly, "in exactly the same way. The horrors of war did not pass me by simply because I was an officer." There must have been something in his tone that made her accept his words as the truth, because her face softened. "His letters said not all you toffs were a bad lot." "No," he agreed, "not all of us are. I am genuinely sorry for your loss, Mrs. Gregory." She pointed towards the entrance of the hotel. "Can I go now?" "Yes, thank you for talking to me." "You didn't give me much choice, Lord Northmore." She walked a few steps towards the hotel, then turned back to him. "It may interest you to know that I have 7 children of my own. The last thing I would take home from this place is another child, even if it was only for a short time until your family paid a ransom." "I see," Tommy nodded. "I'm sorry if I caused you any offence. That certainly wasn't my intention." Nellie Gregory didn't look back again as she walked up to the hotel, her back straight and her head held high. He couldn't imagine what her life must be like, with no husband and 7 children to raise alone. 18 months previously, Tommy had opened an establishment in York for former soldiers who were down on their luck. William Christie House provided evening meals and a bed for the evening for as many soldiers as it could. The manager also helped soldiers to apply for jobs. Tommy couldn't help but wonder if there was scope to expand the remit of the charity to cover some sort of assistance for widows and their families. That was a concern for another day. Today had to be the day they brought Josephine back to her parents. He stared across the road to the sea, where the orange ball of sun marked the beginning of another beautiful day in Scarborough. Tommy hoped that wherever Josephine was, she was being cared for, and that when this was all over, the little girl would never remember this terrible time in her young life. "Oh, good morning, Lady Northmore. How are you this morning?" Ruth Benson raised a hand to greet Evelyn, as she walked into the dining room for breakfast. Ordinarily, Evelyn would have taken her meal in her room, but that morning she wanted to speak with as many people as she could. Absolutely frantic, Mrs. Benson, as I'm sure you can imagine. Ruth Benson frowned. Why? What has happened? Didn't you hear the ruckus last night? I had thought we kept the whole hotel awake for hours. The other woman shook her head. I sleep through absolutely anything, Lady Northmore. I always take a sleeping draught when I'm away from home, as I don't tend to sleep well when not in my own bed at home. What happened? It's Josephine, Mrs. Benson. That delightful child. I believe she belongs to your husband's cousin. Yes, Evelyn nodded. That is correct. I understand from her nanny, Elsie, that you would often stop and speak to her and Josephine when they were out for their afternoon walk. Ruth Benson took a moment to answer. She topped up her coffee from a silver decanter. It was impossible not to stop. That child is positively delightful. I do hope there's nothing wrong with her. We all hope that too, Mrs. Benson. Unfortunately, someone broke into the nursery late last night and took Josephine. They took her? Do you mean they kidnapped her? Evelyn eyed the other woman, hoping to see something, some sign that she was being untruthful and may know something about Josephine's kidnap. She was both frustrated and glad in equal measures that it seemed Ruth Benson knew nothing of what had happened to Josephine. Yes, that's right. Ruth looked around the dining room as though either the child would make an appearance or the perpetrator would dart through the room in dark clothes and a balaclava, making it perfectly obvious he was the culprit. Of course, neither of those things happened. That's perfectly dreadful. Poor Mrs. Ryder must be completely devastated. I don't know your family well at all, but it's clear to me that she positively dotes on that child. We all do, Evelyn said, feeling the heavy weight of helplessness pressing down on her shoulders. What can I do to help? Lord Northmore and I are doing what we can to investigate this crime so that we can return Josephine home to her parents quickly. I hope you won't mind if I ask you a few questions. Do please sit down, Lady Northmore. Mrs. Benson indicated the seat opposite. I don't mind if I do, but of course I shall move as soon as your husband comes down for breakfast. Evelyn pulled out the chair and sat down. Although it had been many months now since she could sit comfortably at a table, it still surprised her just how far away she had to position her chair to accommodate her rounded stomach. Oh, Archie had breakfast hours ago, Ruth said. He's a very early riser. I believe he's gone for a stroll around Peaseholm Park. Where is your sister-in-law this morning? Is she always as quiet as she was last night? Ruth Benson fiddled with her napkin. She looked at Evelyn, then lifted her coffee cup and took a sip. She went home. Evelyn frowned. But she was at dinner last evening. How on earth did she get home? The trains would certainly have stopped running by then. The hotel manager drove her home in his own motor car. Ruth's lips pressed closed and she wore a pained expression as though admitting this information caused her physical pain. May I ask, do you live close by? We are in Pickering, so not so very far away. Were you due to leave today? Oh no, we've booked for 2 weeks and Archie and I intend to stay for the duration. We still have over a week left. And Miss Benson? Was she also due to stay 2 weeks? Ruth Benson again fiddled with her napkin and looked around the dining room as though hoping someone would come along and interrupt their conversation so she didn't have to keep answering what were clearly uncomfortable questions for her. Yes, she was. Do you know why she ended her holiday abruptly? I'm afraid I do not, Lady Northmore. My sister-in-law is a very private person and does not tend to bring me into her confidence. Does she accompany you on your afternoon walks? No, she never did. The other woman looked increasingly ill at ease. Archie likes to walk in the morning. I prefer to walk in an afternoon. Miss Benson prefers to sit in the library and read books. Now, there is nothing wrong with that. It is a perfectly acceptable pastime for a young lady. However, one can read books from one's own library at home. It seems rather a shame to come somewhere as picturesque as Scarborough, and then sit inside for the duration of your stay. Yes, I can definitely see that. Perhaps she made some friends more her own age while she was here. I wouldn't have thought so. Mabel is quite a shy girl. Archie would positively love it if she found people her own age. It isn't that either of us mind that she comes along with us wherever we go, but I do feel that it would be more fun for her if she had a younger crowd of people to experience places with, rather like Lord Northmoor's sister Grace. Evelyn said the words without thinking. She could just see the similarities between the two girls. They were both in their late teens, quiet, and preferred reading a book to socializing with the older group of guests. What do you mean by that? Ruth Benson asked rather sharply. Simply that they have things in common, Evelyn replied. I meant nothing more than precisely that. Ruth Benson's face had flushed, and Evelyn wondered why her innocent comment had flustered the other woman. She recalled only too clearly the conversation she had had with Ruth Benson the previous evening. Not only had she failed to tell Tommy about what Mrs. Benson had seen, but she had not yet raised the issue with Grace. I see. Ruth Benson got to her feet. Well, if you will excuse me, Lady Northmoor, I have some letters to write. Evelyn barely had time to murmur her acquiescence before Ruth Benson hurried from the dining room. She had no opportunity to ask the woman about her sister-in-law's relationship with the hotel manager. Driving a guest home in his own private vehicle was a very personal task. Just how well did Harold Williamson know Mabel Benson? Lady Caroline Merriweather was sitting outside on the bench in the middle of the hotel's gardens when Tommy eventually found her. Good morning, Lady Caroline. Ah, Lord Northmoor, I expect you have come to quiz me about the disappearance of your cousin's daughter. I do apologize. He held his hands out, the palms facing up. He'd given rather a lot of apologies so far that day. However, we simply must interview everyone, even people such as yourself, who I'm completely positive couldn't have anything to do with Josephine's kidnap. I am hoping it is possible you might have seen or heard something, or perhaps have a clue about the identity of the perpetrator. I shall do all that I can. Lady Emily has been a dear friend of mine for years, as you know. You all must be exceedingly worried about the little girl. Did you say her name is Josephine? Yes, that's right. My cousin Madeline's father was French, and so she wanted to choose a name for her daughter that worked in both French and English, rather like her own. Tommy did not add that Madeline's natural father was also a Frenchman, who had died shortly before her birth. It's a very pretty name. Tommy smiled. Older ladies often said things like that. In fact, he could remember Aunt Em saying something similar about the names of Lady Caroline's daughters the previous day. However, it didn't help in discovering anything about the child's kidnap. Lady Caroline, did you go straight to your suite of rooms last night after dinner? I had rather a headache, so after the meal was over, I went straight up. I understand that you young people like to sit around drinking cocktails until the early hours. That is not for a person of my age. I don't mind a stiff gin and tonic or a nice glass of wine, but I don't see the attraction of cocktails, I'm afraid. My sisters are forever trying to get our butler to make concoctions they tell me is the next new thing. I don't understand all the fuss about throwing a lot of different ingredients into a glass either. So you are not alone. There are so many things that young people enjoy these days that I can barely comprehend. Lady Caroline's eyes became misty. Why, I remember when my girls were young. Well, you're not here to listen to my reminiscences, are you? How else can I help you, Lord Northmoor? Did you hear anything unusual last night? I most certainly did. It would have been quite impossible not to know that something was going on in the hotel. All that noise and running feet, it's not what one expects to hear in the Imperial. Quite. I'm afraid it must have sounded like a herd of wild animals were stampeding through the hotel. I apologize if we disturbed your rest, Lady Caroline." She waved his apology away with a heavily beringed hand.
"Oh, my goodness. My sleep is quite secondary to a missing child, Lord Northmore. Please tell me that you are getting close to locating her."
"We are doing our very best. The police have uniformed officers all over Scarborough to find either Josephine or clues, or some sort of information regarding the person that carried out this terrible crime. Lady Northmore and I are also trying to help the police in any small way that we can."
Lady Caroline wagged a finger in his direction in the exact same way that Aunt Em had done to him hundreds of times. "Now, don't be so modest. Lady Emily was regaling me only yesterday about all of the successes you and Lady Northmore have had in uncovering the perpetrators of some quite ghastly crimes. So I'm certain that you will have success in this one too."
Tommy inclined his head. "Your confidence in us is very reassuring. Now, I shall leave you to enjoy the gardens while I carry on my investigations. Perhaps you would let either myself or Lady Northmore, or indeed the police, know if you think of anything that you believe may help."
"Oh, indeed, Lord Northmore. You should know that goes without saying. Good luck in your endeavours."
Chapter 4.
"Mr. Williamson, a word, if you please."
Evelyn put as much Aunt Em-inspired vim and vigour into her words as she could. He bowed slightly from the waist. "Of course, Lady Northmore. Whatever I can do to help, you only must ask." Evelyn pointed at the door behind the reception desk marked private.
"I think it would be best if we went in there."
"As you wish, Lady Northmore." The hotel manager took a seat behind his exceedingly neat and clean walnut-coloured desk. "How may I be of assistance?" Evelyn decided it was absolutely pointless prevaricating when she really wanted to put the man on the back foot.
"I heard a rather disturbing allegation yesterday."
"Is this in relation to the disappearance of Josephine Ryder?"
"No, it is not."
Evelyn folded her arms on top of her stomach.
"It is in relation to my sister-in-law."
Harold Williamson frowned. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. Who has made this allegation?"
"I'd rather not say." Evelyn assessed the man. His manner was as calm and easy as it had been when she entered the room. He didn't seem in the least flustered or concerned about the turn of conversation. "However, I will say that your behaviour falls way short of what one would expect from an establishment such as this. In fact, it is fully shorter than one would expect from any man."
"I'm afraid you're going to have to enlighten me further, Lady Northmore."
He leaned forward on his desk slightly, leaning the tips of his fingers on the smooth mahogany.
"What is the nature of the allegation?"
"I have been told that you kissed my sister-in-law. You did so with no encouragement from her, and you also performed this quite outrageous assault upon her person in a secluded area. I'm quite horrified that you did this to any female, but particularly one who has been raised in an exceedingly quiet and genteel way."
"I believed your sister-in-law to be engaged to Lord Cheston."
Evelyn knew procrastination when she saw it. "I think you know that I have two sisters-in-law. Constance is indeed engaged to be married to Lord Cheston. Grace, however, is a rather naive and shy girl who is not accustomed to strange men trying to force their affections on her."
"You have been ill-informed, Lady Northmore. I can quite categorically deny that this incident ever happened."
"The person who shared this information with me is extremely reliable." Even as she said the words, Evelyn doubted their veracity. Ruth Benson had acted strangely that morning, particularly when having to explain that Mabel had gone home. There was something the lady wasn't telling her. However, she seemed suitably embarrassed when telling her about the liaison between the hotel manager and Grace. In her opinion, they were truthful.
"Perhaps it is possible. This reliable person misidentified me. You said the incident happened in a secluded area. I suggest to you that it was another fellow enjoying a romantic moment with your sister-in-law. because it certainly was not me." This explanation was so smooth and well delivered that it took Evelyn a moment to remember that it was within his best interests to convince her that the person with Grace was not him. She wasn't sure if Harold Williamson's family had the means to send him to further his education, but since they had, it did not surprise Evelyn he chose a career in law. Not only did he appear completely unflappable, but he spoke with both eloquence and an exceptionally persuasive tone. Evelyn wanted to automatically refute his suggestion that it was someone else, but really, how well did she know either the hotel manager or Ruth Benson? However, despite his charming persona, she believed he was lying to her. "If Lord Northmore were to find out, I can guarantee he would ensure that your employment here ceased forthwith." The hotel manager's eyes narrowed, and a frown marred his handsome face for the briefest of moments. His expression cleared so quickly, Evelyn wondered if the frown had ever been there. "There will be no need for such a suggestion. As I have told you, the person involved was not me. I do not wish to interfere with your family business, but perhaps the best thing for you to do would be to ensure that the young lady in question is not sneaking around the hotel gardens and potentially getting herself into difficult situations in the future." Perhaps a career in law was not for him after all. He blinked rapidly as he realized his mistake. Evelyn pounced on it. "I did not tell you where the alleged embrace occurred. Lady Northmore, you said that it was a secluded area. I know of no other secluded areas than those in the gardens." "I disagree," Evelyn said as she pierced the man with her sternest glare, whom she was quickly feeling an intense dislike for. "I am certain that you do." "Lady Northmore, I insist." Evelyn pointed at him, her anger sparking into life. "No, Mr. Williamson, I insist. You stay away from every member of my family. I do not wish to see you speaking to anyone connected with my family. Do we understand each other?" "I am very sorry that you seem to mistrust me." He smiled in a way that Evelyn was sure worked with most other females. However, it simply infuriated her further. "How should I share information regarding the police investigation with you if you do not wish me to speak to anyone in your family?" "That should be obvious for a man who thinks himself as clever as you," Evelyn snapped. "We shall take updates directly from the police themselves. As a member of the staff of this hotel, our personal lives are none of your business." "As you wish, my lady." She knew she had a hard conversation with Tommy ahead of her. Before she spoke to him, she would speak directly to Grace and get the girl's side of the story first. After all, Tommy would be away from the hotel for at least a couple of hours, which gave her plenty of time to speak to Grace and do more sleuthing. Tommy took the family motorcar to drive the relatively short distance to Pickering. Although he could see the benefits of motor vehicles, he could also see the downsides. Compared to a horse and carriage, they seemed chaotic and loud. Not to mention, one could trot along quite happily in a carriage, but that could never be said for a motor car. They zoomed along at a quite outrageous speed. Tommy drove as quickly as he dared, aware he needed to get back to the hotel to progress the investigation after he had spoken to Mabel Benson. He stopped in the centre of the pretty market town to consult his map before driving on towards the Benson household. Parking at a rather jaunty angle in front of the neat Georgian house, Tommy approached the front door and gave the knocker a resounding rat-a-tat-tat. A butler opened the door and looked Tommy up and down before looking disdainfully at the Bentley and then back at Tommy. "Yes, sir. How can I be of assistance?" "I have come to call on Miss Mabel Benson," Tommy announced. "Miss Benson is not receiving visitors today," the butler replied imperiously. "Perhaps you could tell her that Lord Northmore is calling." "Well, yes, my lord, I can." Upon hearing Tommy's title, the butler practically fell over himself to turn away from the door. He seemed to remember his manners just in time. "Please, come inside. Take a seat while I speak with Miss Benson." Tommy hoped that the young lady in question would reconsider her orders or requests to the butler and speak with him. If she declined, it would be rather awkward for him to force himself past the butler so he could speak to Miss Benson. Time was passing so quickly since little Josephine had gone missing. If it was at all possible Miss Benson knew anything, he was determined to speak to her and to find out just what she knew. But he returned quickly and gave a slight bow. "Miss Benson will see you now." Tommy followed the butler down the right corridor, walking past what he was certain was the drawing room, to a room at the back of the house. The butler opened the door and stepped inside. "Lord Northmore to see you, Miss Benson." As he stood back, Tommy entered the room and saw that Mabel Benson was sitting in a comfortable-looking chair near the window, reading a book in what was clearly the house's library. He recalled Evelyn telling him that the young lady liked to read and was quite a shy girl. "Thank you for agreeing to see me, Miss Benson." "I didn't think you had driven all this way from Scarborough if it was not important. If it had been anyone else at the door, I would have turned them away." "Can I bring you any refreshments, Miss Benson?" the butler asked. "Not for me, thank you, Foster. Would you like something after your journey, Lord Northmore?" "You were right in your assumption that I'm here on a very important matter." Tommy nodded at the butler. "Ordinarily, I would be happy to accept refreshments, but I must speak with Miss Benson and return to the hotel as quickly as possible." Foster nodded and retreated from the room. "How intriguing, Lord Northmore. Please do take a seat and tell me how you think I can help." "I do not think that you were aware before you left the hotel that a quite terrible incident took place." Mabel Benson flushed unbecomingly. Her face was mottled as though someone had thrown a glass of Merlot at her. "My cousin's child, Josephine Ryder, was kidnapped from her crib whilst her parents were at dinner." Mabel Benson drew in a deep breath. "Oh my goodness, Lord Northmore. That is dreadful. I'm desperately sorry to hear that, but I don't see how I can help you." "I do not wish to distress you, but I would like to get straight to the point, if I may." The young lady looked down at the book in her lap, clearly signifying that she would much rather carry on reading than answer Tommy's questions. "Do go on, Lord Northmore." "I understand that when you left the hotel last night, you were driven home by the hotel manager. Would you mind telling me why you decided to leave so suddenly?" Mabel Benson continued to look downwards. The redness on her face had now spread to her neck, and even her ears looked rather pink. "This is all terribly embarrassing." "Would you like me to call in a housemaid? Would it help for you to have another female with you while you speak with me?" "Oh no, Lord Northmore. It would be even worse to allow a member of the staff to hear how very silly I have been. I couldn't bear it. If they knew of my folly—" Tommy tried to think of what he might say to his sister if she were upset and afraid she had embarrassed herself. "I'm sure it's not nearly as bad as you think. Perhaps it might be best if you just tell me everything as quickly as you can, without thinking of the emotions attached to the events." "I thought Mr. Williamson had romantic feelings towards me. I then discovered that he had made advances towards your sister Grace. That made me feel quite ridiculous. I don't know why I thought Mr. Williamson would hold feelings for someone as mousy and insignificant as me. It's for that reason I couldn't wait to get away from the hotel and come home. I couldn't bear to tell my sister-in-law what happened, and was even further mortified to find out the person given the task of bringing me home was the very man who had caused my embarrassment." Tommy was very grateful that his suggestion worked, and Mabel Benson told him everything in one long stream of conversation. However, it took him a few moments to assimilate what she had said. He tried to tamp down his anger on hearing that the hotel manager had somehow approached his youngest sister. "Did you speak to Mr. Williamson as he was driving you home?" I did not. Mabel glanced at Tommy and then down at her fingers as they stroked the spine of the book in her lap. I couldn't think of a single thing to say to him that would not make me feel worse than I already did, which of course was perfectly dreadful. Tommy paused once more as he tried to think of an inoffensive way to ask Mabel Benson the next question. Did he apologize for his crass behavior? I don't expect he knew I had discovered his liaison with your sister. I didn't tell him. And my sister-in-law had no reason to think that news would upset me. Of course, I had not told her that he had already spent some time flattering me. How did you find out that you were not the only object of his affections? Mabel gave a short, harsh laugh. I don't think it's true to suggest that I was ever in his affections. I believe the fellow enjoys toying with other people's emotions. Perhaps he thought having me under his influence would benefit him somehow. Then it is possible that he does not have real romantic intentions towards my sister, but is only pretending to for his own benefit. Oh, I would not have such a low opinion of your sister. She is a very beautiful girl, and it wouldn't surprise me whatsoever to find out that Mr. Williamson is deeply in love with her. How can he possibly be in love with Grace? Mabel tapped her fingers on the book on her lap as her expression turned morose. I understand love at first sight is a quite beautiful thing. Tommy realized then exactly how similar Mabel and Grace were. Both girls were very innocent in the ways of the world and only knew of relationships and love in the pages of the books they read. He had hoped Grace had a better understanding, given her exposure to his happy marriage to Evelyn. Although he wasn't enamoured of Lord Cheston, even he had to admit that the man was head over heels in love with his sister Constance. I'm beginning to think that my journey here will not help me uncover the person who kidnapped Josephine. It seems that Mr. Williamson has a thoroughly rotten personality, but one thing seems certain. If he was driving you home last night, he couldn't have kidnapped Josephine. Mabel Benson extracted a handkerchief from the sleeve of her blouse and blotted under her eyes. Please don't tell my brother or my sister-in-law any of what I have told you. I just couldn't bear it. Archie would be so very cross with me. Miss Benson, I can't think of any reason I would have to tell either of your relatives any of what you have told me. I had hoped that you leaving the hotel so suddenly might have some bearing on Josephine's kidnap, but I can't see any way that it does, so your secret is safe with me. However, I feel I must speak to Mr. Williamson about his behaviour immediately. Perhaps you can do that simply in relation to your sister? Mabel asked hopefully. Yes, I think that I can. Will you be content with simply speaking to Mr. Williamson? That will certainly not be the end of it. Tommy got to his feet. I hope it does not distress you, Miss Benson, but without a doubt, I shall speak to the hotel's owner and insist that he be dismissed immediately. Please tell me you are close to finding little Josephine, Aunt Em said, looking every one of her years. I just can't bear the thought that she is out there without adequate care. And love, Evelyn added. Everyone who meets her loves that child, but of course none more so than her parents. She must be missing her loved ones dreadfully. I am sure Tommy will come back from Pickering with all the answers. Grace gave a small smile. He's so very clever. I should warn you, my dear. Evelyn looked at her sister-in-law with dread. She desperately didn't want to talk to her about the hotel manager, but she had no choice. It was almost inevitable that Tommy would return to the hotel with more questions than answers after speaking to Mabel Benson. Mr. Williamson took Miss Benson back to her home. Grace ducked her head. What does that have to do with me? I am reliably informed that the man dared to kiss you yesterday. Aunt Em gasped. The audacity of the man! His hotel staff, how dare he? I would hope we would all be suitably outraged if the man in question was the Prince of Wales himself. A man's station should not matter when he has overstepped propriety. Evelyn spoke with no censure. After all, her initial reaction had been exactly the same as Aunt Em's.
What do you have to say for yourself, young lady?
Aunt Em looked at Grace, the sympathy in her expression at odds with her words. "He did kiss me," Grace whispered. "I wasn't expecting him to do that. I understand he was whispering in your ear directly before he did that." "Oh, Eve!" Grace held up her hands to cover her burning cheeks. "How can you know that?"
"Come now, dear," Aunt Em said. "You know that Tommy and Evelyn know everything, and what they don't know they soon find out. It really isn't worth trying to keep secrets when they are around."
"He's very handsome," Grace said with a slight smile. "He's a scoundrel," Evelyn retorted, finding it hard to keep her patience with her sister-in-law. How could she not see how terrible his behaviour had been? "Your brother will be rightly furious." "We don't have to tell him, do we?"
"Did you not listen to a word I just said?"
Aunt Em patted Grace's knee.
"The sooner you tell the entire story, the better."
"I don't understand what this has to do with Josephine's disappearance." "It might have nothing to do with Josephine's kidnapping. But the fact remains that we cannot let the incident be swept underneath the carpet. Mr. Williamson has quite exceeded what is expected of a gentleman."
"Out with it," Aunt Em urged. "How did you come to be in a situation where the man had an opportunity to steal a kiss?"
"We were talking about books," Grace admitted. "He's very clever, you know. He knows ever such a lot about literature." "This is what I find so difficult to understand," Evelyn said. "How did you start conversing in the first place? How did he even know how much you enjoy books?" "I was in the library one day," Grace said, "and he asked if I needed anything, and it went from there. He really is the most solicitous man." Evelyn adjusted the parasol as the three women sat on the balcony of Evelyn and Tommy's suite. "If that were so, he would have approached your brother and asked if he may strike up a conversation with you. Or at the very least, he would have done so when you were in the company of other family members. The fact that he has sought you out when you were alone does not speak well of him or his character." Grace looked as though she might sulk for a moment before she pulled her face into an expressionless mask. "You don't know him like I do?" "Was that the only time he has dared to kiss you?" Grace nodded. "It was." "Did you give him permission?" Evelyn pressed. Slowly, Grace shook her head, as though finally realizing how wrong the hotel manager's behavior was. "I didn't, and I left the gardens as soon as he kissed me."
"You knew it wasn't right then, dear, didn't you?" Aunt Em asked.
"He told me he loved me," Grace said, "and he said so many other lovely things to me. It was nice to feel special." Evelyn reached out and grasped one of the girls' hands. "Has it been so very difficult for you to watch your sister and Lord Chesden?" Grace looked down at the table. "I'm glad for Constance, I really am. She's terribly in love with Alexander and he is with her. I'm happy for them both, but perhaps a little sad for myself." "Yes, I can understand that," Evelyn said. "Perhaps you were lonely, and so Mr. Williamson's flattery was more well received than it ordinarily might have been." Grace nodded. "Yes, I think that is so." "The question is, what we should do about it now."
"There is no question," Aunt Em said insistently. "As soon as Tommy is back, he must be told. He will surely call for the impudent fellow's job. I can't imagine him reacting in any other way."
"Oh no, he can't lose his job because of me," Grace cried. "His family is quite destitute." Evelyn held in the deep sigh that threatened to escape her lips. The hotel manager could have said many things to get into Grace's affections. Most of them were likely to be untrue. "You know your brother will be furious." Evelyn's sentence was cut short as a piercing scream cut through the still summer air. "Where did that come from?" Aunt Em got to her feet. Grace looked at Evelyn and Em, her eyes wide with fear. "It sounded like it came from the next balcony over." Evelyn was on her feet much faster than she had managed in at least the last 3 months. She hurried next door as swiftly as she could. She had barely taken 3 steps into the corridor when the door to the next suite burst open. Madeline stumbled into the corridor and collapsed into Evelyn's arms. "Madeline, darling, what is it?" The other woman's lips trembled as she pointed wordlessly into the room she had just left. Evelyn gave her a slight shake. "What is it? What has you so upset?" "Elsie," Madeline gasped. "Elsie is dead." Chapter 5. "What on earth is going on?" Tommy strode into the suite he shared with Evelyn and addressed his wife, Aunt Em, and Grace, who were all sitting round the table exhibiting varying levels of distress. Aunt Em looked concerned, Evelyn appeared agitated, and Grace looked as though she may burst into tears at any moment. "While you were gone, Madeline discovered poor Elsie strangled in Josephine's nursery." Evelyn sipped her tea. "What is also concerning is that a ransom note was left on the table. It was addressed to you." "Why would it be addressed to me?" "Perhaps the kidnapper does not know that Josephine is not your child. It could be that because the rooms were all booked in your name, the kidnapper believes that you are the one with the most accessible financial means. Or it could mean that the kidnapper knows exactly who you are, precisely who Josephine is, and knows that you are the type of man who would give up everything he owned to ensure Josephine's safe return." Tommy ran his fingers through his hair and paced over to the window. "That goes without saying. The question is, what are we to do about it? Can I read the letter?" Evelyn shook her head. "No, the police have taken it." "What did it say?" "You know how nervous it makes me when you stride around the room as though you're a caged animal." Evelyn indicated one of the vacant chairs that were arranged around the table. "Please, sit down and let me pour you a cup of tea." Tommy walked to stand behind his wife and placed a hand on her shoulder. "And you know that when I am frustrated and upset that I can't possibly sit down and drink tea. Moving around makes me feel as though I am doing something, even if I know logically that it is not helping at all. However, it helps me to think, and I must work out what we should do next. Now, please, tell me what the letter said." "It said that if a particularly large sum of money is left underneath the bench next to the bandstand in Peaceholm Park, that Josephine will be returned to the hotel in good health." "Thank goodness," Tommy said. "At least that sounds as though whoever has her is treating her well, and that taking her was a means to an end rather than they planned any harm to her." "How do we know she is still alive?" Grace asked with a sob. "You could pay the money, and we might never get her back." "You must not let Madeline hear you speak that way," Tommy said sternly to his sister. "But, of course, you are correct. I could pay the money that the kidnapper is asking for, and the fiend may have already disposed of Josephine." "Oh, don't, Tommy," Evelyn said, holding a hand up to cover her mouth. "Please don't talk like that. I just can't bear it." He rubbed her shoulder. "Josephine is a very young child. The chances of her being sold to a childless couple are high, and in those circumstances, the kidnapper would hope to be paid twice. One would think it is in his interests to keep Josephine safe." Tommy could not say the words out loud, nor could he allow himself to even contemplate that Josephine would not survive this terrible ordeal. "While the police are busy dealing with the ransom demand and speaking to David and Madeline, you two simply must find out who killed Elsie. Surely
Josephine's kidnap and her murder are linked. Let us not spend our time focusing on things that we cannot control, but on the things we can. Aunt Em looked at Tommy as she spoke. Now, why don't you tell us what you learned while you were away? Mabel Benson told me that the reason she left so hurriedly was because she believed herself to be in love with Harold Williamson. Oh, my goodness me, not another one, Aunt Em exclaimed. What do you mean, not another one? Tommy asked in confusion. Grace fidgeted in her seat, and Tommy turned a look of puzzlement onto his sister. I'm so sorry, Tommy. What have you to be sorry for? He asked his sister gently. Mr. Williamson and I have been meeting in secret. Tommy looked at his aunt and his wife. What does that even mean? Now, Tommy, Evelyn said, now is not the time for you to lose your temper. Josephine is missing. Elsie is dead, and Aunt Em is quite right. We need to do whatever we can to solve these crimes. The time for recriminations is not now. Tommy heard the underlying tone of both sympathy and an unruffled resolve in Evelyn's voice, but all he could see in front of him was the distress on his sister's face. Darling girl, did that man take liberties with you? Grace flushed. He kissed me. Tommy raised an eyebrow and balled his hands into fists. Without your permission? Grace nodded and looked down at her hands, which were fidgeting in her lap. I enjoyed our conversations, and I thought perhaps I might be falling in love with him. It was so very romantic, but when he kissed me, it didn't feel so very tender anymore. It felt wrong, and I felt terribly guilty. After speaking with Mabel Benson, I was quite ready to punch that fellow on the nose. Now, God help me, I want to break his nose and black both of his eyes. Thomas Christie. Aunt Em slapped her hand on the table for emphasis. It is quite understandable that you are upset, but it is not at all acceptable to commit physical violence or to speak of it in such a coarse way, particularly in front of ladies. I apologize, Aunt Em, Tommy said in a contrite voice, but his eyes held no apology, only a burning fury. But I cannot promise that I will keep my hands to myself when I next see that rogue. Let's summarize where we are in our investigation, Evelyn suggested. Do you think the maid, Nellie Gregory, could be involved? Tommy took a deep breath and relaxed his hands. He shook them to relieve the tension in his fingers before forcing his face into relaxation. She could be, but I rather liked her. As we are all aware, liking someone does not mean that they are innocent. I thought she was very honest, Tommy said. But you're right. We should still treat her like a suspect. I did think that there was something she was hiding from me. I shall speak to her and see if there's anything else that she will tell me. Maybe she was embarrassed to talk openly to you as you are a man. Tommy inclined his head. I intend to speak to Mr. Williamson. I don't want you speaking to that man again. Then I insist I come with you, Aunt Em said. Someone needs to keep that temper of yours in check, and I don't believe you can do that by yourself. I think that sounds very sensible. Thank you, Aunt Em. Mr. Benson walks in Peaseholm Park every morning. His wife told me that. She also admitted that she walks there herself in an afternoon. Strangely, they do not seem to go together. The Bensons do not have children, do they? Aunt Em asked. No, Evelyn said, they do not. Then do we all agree that it is possible that the Bensons arranged for Josephine to be kidnapped and intend to both collect the ransom and then disappear with her? They could be taking turns to care for her, Tommy suggested. I do agree that it is possible. Evelyn finished her tea and replaced her teacup on its matching saucer. However, rather like you with Mrs. Gregory, I don't want to believe that could be true. Mrs. Benson seems like rather a good sort. Her husband is terribly reserved, Aunt Em said. I would have thought that meant you rather liked him, Tommy observed. There is a difference between reserved and completely devoid of emotion, my boy. I have never seen him express any fondness for either his wife or his sister. Therefore, I do not trust him at all. You must admit it is rather suspicious that he knows Peaseholm Park well. And the kidnapper also suggests that it is used for the delivery of the ransom. That may be simply because it is a nearby public place, Evelyn suggested. It is likely to be full of people, and presumably whoever intends to collect the ransom believes that they will be able to leave the park unobserved. Is there anything else that we need to consider? Anyone else we need to speak to before we leave each other and carry on with our investigations?
Evelyn shook her head. I don't believe so.
I want you to find Constance and stay with her, Tommy said to Grace. Although his voice was firm, it was not unkind. Tell her that I said you must both stay with Lord Chesden at all times, until I come to find you.
Grace nodded. Yes, of course, Tommy.
You do understand that now is not the time to disobey me.
Yes, Tommy, Grace answered meekly. Knowing that a killer is roaming free is more than enough incentive for me to do as you ask.
Tommy looked at Evelyn, and words passed between them without needing to actually say them out loud.
Yes, darling, Evelyn nodded. I will take care not to be alone, and will only go to the public parts of the hotel.
Oh, for goodness sake, Aunt Em snapped. Have you both taken leave of your senses? Evelyn, you will take Grace with you when you speak to Mrs. Gregory. Afterwards, you can ensure that Grace finds Constance and that all the ladies in our family stay together safely with Lord Chesden. That way, no one needs to be alone.
Tommy let out the breath that he had been holding.
Yes, Aunt Em, that is a much more sensible plan. Don't you think so, my dear?
Well done, Aunt Em.
Evelyn clapped her hands together briskly and got to her feet.
You have quite saved the day with your suggestion.
Tommy strode over to the door and opened it for his wife and sister to go through. I shall come and find you when Aunt Em and I have finished our conversation with Mr. Williamson. He hoped that his aunt's presence when speaking to the hotel manager would be enough to keep his fury in check. It had been such a long time since he had felt the force of anger like that coursing through him at that moment. He needed to put his emotions into a box to deal with later and focus on the investigation. Losing his temper would not help them find Josephine.
Evelyn hurried along the corridor. A uniformed police officer stood outside the room that Madeline and David had used as a nursery for Josephine.
As she and Grace walked past him, he held up a hand. Where are you going?
The pillow slips on my bed are quite incorrect. They are made of an inferior material, and quite definitely not cotton, Evelyn said haughtily. I am looking for the maid, so I can ask her to exchange them immediately. If my husband were to see them, I'm quite afraid that he may insist she be dismissed.
The police officer blinked. I see. Isn't it rather drastic to want someone's employment to end because of the material of your pillow slips?
Can't you see that Lady Northmore is trying to prevent that very outcome? Grace asked, in a voice that mirrored that of her sister-in-law.
Then hurry along, he said. I have strict instructions that no one should wander the corridors. Aren't you ladies aware that there has been a murder in the hotel?
We are very aware, Evelyn snapped. Now, do step out of the way so that we can make sure that there is not another one.
The police officer dropped his hand and stepped back, so the heels of his black boots were flush against the door. Yes, Lady Northmore, at once.
As soon as they were out of earshot, Grace caught hold of Evelyn's arm. You sound more like Aunt Em every day. Evelyn smiled grimly. It seems that the further this pregnancy progresses, the more I rely on speaking my mind, not suffering fools gladly, and using both my title and particularly my social standing to get what I want. If that means I sound more like Aunt Em, then I am extremely flattered. She will be so pleased to know that she has a protégé, Grace grinned. I rather think that successive generations of the Christie family have disappointed her. In my opinion, she will be quite delighted that you and Tommy managed to successfully combine being unique whilst still adhering to what society expects from a titled family. I appreciate your support. Evelyn smiled at her sister-in-law Riley. However, your brother is still going to be furious with you, more so with Mr. Williamson, but he will also be cross that you put yourself into such a dangerous and uncompromising position. Do not think that a little flattery will get you out of the stern lecture that I am sure will come your way. Grace nodded and ducked her head. I do understand that, Ev, but goodness me, you're practically metamorphosing into Aunt Em. Evelyn knocked on the door to David and Madeline's suite of rooms, even though she knew they were downstairs talking with the police. She hoped that the maid, Nellie Gregory, was still cleaning their room. The door opened, and the hotel worker looked at Evelyn and Grace in surprise. Lady Northmore, how can I help you? I know that you spoke to my husband earlier today, but I hope that you won't mind also answering a few questions I have. As I've told your husband, and begging your pardon, but I don't know how I can possibly help you. I am a war widow. I carry out my duties to the very best of my abilities, and then I go home to my 7 children. I don't wish to get into any trouble, and neither do I want to speak ill of anyone else who works at the hotel. I need this job, Lady Northmore. Perhaps we can come inside, Evelyn suggested. I can promise anything you tell me will not be repeated to anyone other than my husband. All either of us wants is the safe return of Josephine. As a mother yourself, I'm sure you can understand the very great distress the child's kidnap is causing her parents. Nellie pushed the door wide to allow Evelyn and Grace to enter the bedroom. I would be grateful if you could ask me your questions quickly, so I can get on with my work. As an almost mother yourself, I'm sure you will appreciate that my primary concern is getting home to my children and keeping my job. As I told your husband, the pension that I receive from the government barely covers the cost of feeding my family. I don't have rich relations that can help me provide for my children. Evelyn could understand why Tommy liked this woman. Her honesty was quite brutal, and not only was she embarrassed that she had so very much, while the other woman had so little, she couldn't help but admire Nellie. I shall get immediately to the point. My husband and I are grateful for what you have told us so far. However, Lord Northmore was certain that you left something out when you spoke to him earlier today. Not only is there a child missing, but her nanny has now been murdered. Now is not the time to hide anything that you might know out of some sort of misplaced loyalty. Nellie's gaze moved from Evelyn to Grace, then back to Evelyn. I think the nanny had a fancy man. Evelyn narrowed her eyes at Nellie. You think? The maid sighed. It wasn't anything that she said to me. It was more how she acted. As one married woman to another, I'm sure you remember the days when you were first courting your husband. You made an extra effort with your hair, probably added a touch of colour to your face, and certainly made sure that you were wearing your very best clothes, even if there was the slightest chance that you might bump into him. Are you suggesting that was the way Elsie was acting? With impending dismay, Evelyn remembered back to the mystery that she and Tommy had solved the previous winter. Elsie had been personally involved with the church warden. She had been persuaded by both Elsie and the girl's mother that the fellow involved led Elsie astray. Now, Evelyn couldn't help but wonder if it was the other way around. Most certainly, Lady Northmore. While I understand Elsie had a uniform, and so could not have put on her prettiest dress in the same way that you or I would, she had a habit of primping her hair in the bathroom mirror, and I particularly noticed that she always ensured that her shoes were shining. Then, of course, I'm sure you noticed yourself that she had taken to wearing a rather bright shade of lipstick. Evelyn stared at Nellie in horror. The other woman's words were true, but Evelyn realized with a sinking heart that she had observed none of these things herself. She thought back to her time in India earlier that year and remembered what the maid at the hotel there had told her. Sarita said that she was very careful to notice everything in the hotel guests' rooms. She explained it was in case anything ever went missing. She could say when she last saw it. It made sense to Evelyn that Nellie had similarly been observant when working at the Majestic. Do you know who that might have been? I do not. You didn't discuss it with Elsie? Evelyn raised an eyebrow. I understand there were several conversations of a personal nature that went on between the two of you. That's true, my lady. To Nellie's great credit, she did not look away when speaking to Evelyn. She must know that Elsie had shared the nature of their discussions. If she did not tell you herself who it was, perhaps you may have some thoughts about whom it might be? Yes, I do. Nellie glanced again at Grace. But I believe that voicing my suspicions might get me into trouble with the management of the hotel. Then you have told me who the person is, Evelyn said. You very clearly mean Harold Williamson, the manager? I did not say that, Nellie replied. Evelyn inclined her head and gave the maid a slight smile. No, you did not. Thank you, Mrs. Gregory. Aunt Em accompanied Tommy downstairs to the hotel manager's office. The receptionist stopped them before Tommy could knock on the door. May I help you, Lord Northmore? I am looking for Mr. Williamson, Tommy said pleasantly, even as anger flooded through him. I believe he may be in the library, the receptionist said. He spends much of his spare time in there. Alone? The receptionist looked down at the desk. I'm afraid I really couldn't tell you. Are the police still speaking with Mr. and Mrs. Ryder? Yes. The receptionist shook her head sadly. Poor Mrs. Ryder. We all feel most dreadfully sorry for her. Tommy nodded. Thank you for your help. Now, Tommy, Aunt Em said, you must not jump to conclusions. Perhaps the man simply likes to read. Tommy and Aunt Em walked away from the hotel lobby and towards the library. We know at least 2 young women that also like to read and have then believed themselves to be in love with him. At best, he is misguided. At worst, he is an absolute danger to women. Evelyn said that she believed he was quite intelligent. He certainly doesn't talk like a hotel manager. What do you mean? He sounds like every other hotel manager that I've ever met. Hotel managers tend to speak with no discernible accent. However, Mr. Williamson speaks like a young man who has attended the best schools in England. I can't help but wonder about his education. Grace told Evelyn and I that she believed he was very intelligent and knew a lot about literature. She also said that he had told her that his family was destitute. What are you trying to tell me? Simply that he is a person who would benefit from receiving the ransom money. Tommy frowned. Unfortunately, that seems to be the problem. He has an excellent motive, but so do our other suspects. Mrs. Gregory is struggling to support her children. Mr. and Mrs. Benson do not have children and may have kidnapped Josephine so they can both have a child and enough money to leave the country with her. As expected, the door to the library stood open. Harold Williamson sat in a comfortable leather armchair next to the window, which overlooked the hotel gardens. He had a book open in his lap, but his attention was focused outside. Aunt Em reached out and put a restraining hand on Tommy's arm. Take a deep breath, Thomas, and consider your words before you speak. Tommy nodded at his aunt as he strode into the library. Mr. Williamson, a word. A look of absolute fright crossed the hotel manager's face before he schooled his expression into one of careful neutrality. He darted a quick look at the clock above the fireplace, then arranged his lips into a welcoming smile. Good afternoon, Lord Northmore. Is it? Is it what? Harold Williamson frowned. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. It isn't a good afternoon, is it, Mr. Williamson? My cousin's child is still missing. I have also learned today that you do not seem to be able to control your romantic feelings. Apparently, you have been spending time alone with several young ladies, one of whom is now laid dead upstairs. Has anyone suggested that I have done anything untoward? I am friendly with all the hotel guests. Yes, Aunt Em said firmly. Tommy blinked, but otherwise did not react. He did not know what his aunt was going to say, but he trusted she knew what she was doing. Yes? The hotel manager looked inquiringly at the old lady. This gave Tommy the opportunity to study the other man. Although he was giving a good impression of being completely at ease with the conversation, Tommy could see a bead of sweat on the man's temple. I have received a complaint about your behaviour, which I certainly will take up with the hotel's owners. Aunt Em's stare was so brutal that it caused the bubble of sweat on the hotel manager's face to join the others running down his face. May I know the details of the grievance? All I shall say is that your behaviour was unbecoming for a gentleman. Sadly, the young lady in question cannot make her criticism of your unseemly behaviour official, because you killed her before she could. Harold Williamson ran a finger along his collar, then brought out a handkerchief and daintily dabbed his face. Are you talking about the child's nanny? Indeed, I am. You should be ashamed of yourself. I'm afraid you're very much mistaken. The hotel manager recovered himself, and Tommy was amazed at the transformation. His confident air was back, and Tommy understood why Aunt Em thought he may have received his education from one of the better establishments. I am the hotel manager, and had very little reason to speak with your nanny, nor do I believe that she would have spoken to you about me or any other personal matter. Are you accusing me of lying? Perhaps you were mistaken, he said solicitously. Or maybe you did not hear the poor girl properly. Tommy heard the sharp intake of his aunt's breath. He could scarcely believe himself that Harold Williamson was suggesting that Aunt Em was either deaf or had remembered incorrectly. The conversation was quickly getting away from him. He was struck with an immediate desire to do something that would progress the investigation. Tommy decided he must speak to the police. The ransom note was addressed to him. He needed to find out when the letter suggested the ransom drop take place. Perhaps that would be the thing to draw the kidnapper out into the public, where they could be detained by the police. It was time to bring this matter to a close, uncover Elsie's murderer, and return Josephine to her parents. Chapter 6. Evelyn slowly got to her feet as Tommy and Aunt Em entered the lounge. Their entire party had gathered in the large room. Unfortunately, the other guests seemed to understand that it was not appropriate for them to use that room at that time. The hotel had plenty of other rooms for their use, and Evelyn was glad it afforded the family the privacy they needed. Please tell me that you did not assault that dreadful man. Evelyn, dear, I assured you nothing of that sort would happen if I accompanied your husband. Now, show me the regard that I deserve. I am of much more use than anything you give me credit for. Evelyn was momentarily dumbstruck. Although everyone knew that Aunt Em had an acerbic tongue, she was not usually as abrupt with those nearest to her. I am sorry if I gave you that impression, Aunt Em. I meant no disrespect. You well know that none of us would know what to do without you. What did you find out from speaking to the maid? Tommy asked, in a clear attempt to ease the uncomfortable tension. Reading between the lines, she thinks there may have been a relationship between Harold Williamson and Elsie, Evelyn replied. She was careful not to mention him by name and to clarify that she did not have any proof of her belief. Tommy glanced at Aunt Em. Aunt Em suggested the very same thing to Mr. Williamson. How did you know? Evelyn asked in wonder. It was the lipstick, Aunt Em said, with a self-satisfied smile. It was
quite an inappropriate shade for a children's nanny. Such a bold colour signified to me that she was wearing it to attract a man. It's rather like peacocks, but of course in reverse. Male peacocks display their feathers to attract a mate. Women do a similar thing by making themselves as colourful as they can if there is a fellow in the vicinity whom they are interested in. Evelyn blinked. Usually she was the one who noticed such things, and then put together the pieces of the puzzles they were investigating. It was probably a good thing she had already decided that her sleuthing days were over as soon as Josephine was returned to her parents. She could not bear to think of the alternative, so had resolved to only think of Josephine's disappearance with a positive outcome. Very soon she would have her own child to care for, and investigations and dead bodies would be somebody else's concern. They certainly would not be hers, and a jolly good thing that was too, because Aunt Em was doing a better job of sleuthing in this case than she was. "Gosh, Aunt Em," Grace said, "I was just telling Evelyn upstairs how much like you she is these days. Now, you sound just like her." "That is because we are older, have more experience, and as a result are so much wiser than you are." Aunt Em gave Grace a rather superior smile. "Yes, of course," Grace said meekly. "What's next, Northmore?" Teddy Mannering asked. Tommy turned to look at his old friend. "I'll speak to the police. They have received a ransom note, and I should like to be the one to take the money to the drop-off point." "I say, won't that be rather dangerous?" Alexander Ryder asked. "Possibly," Tommy replied, "but it will be worth it if Josephine is returned to your brother and Madeline." "Perhaps you should let me do it." Alexander got to his feet and walked over to Tommy's side. "You have a wife and your own child to think about. I have neither." "Alexander!" Constance cried. "Hush, dear," Aunt Em said. "You must let Lord Chesden do what he feels is necessary." Tommy patted Alexander's shoulder. "Let us both go speak to the police and see what they say." "I don't understand," Grace said. "If the kidnapper wants money, why would they want to hurt you, Tommy?" "They may wish me out of the way once they have collected the ransom. My use to them at that point will be over. Perhaps I may catch sight of them, and then they will decide they have to kill me, so I don't reveal their identity. I suppose the point is we just don't know what might happen." "Oh, Tommy, I do wish you wouldn't go," Grace said beseechingly. "I agree," Constance said, "but I don't want Alexander to go either." "Now, girls, do stop worrying." Tommy smiled at his sisters. "Someone has to go, and I feel certain that the policemen will want it to be somebody in the family. We shall go see them and let them determine who it shall be." "If the kidnapper intends to collect the ransom money," Evelyn said slowly, "then where will Josephine be while he does that?" "I thought about that," Tommy said. "We've already discussed the possibility that Mr. and Mrs. Benson are involved in Josephine's disappearance. If not them, it certainly seems more likely than not that there are at least a couple of people working together." Tommy left the hotel manager's office after speaking to the police, his shoulders drawn back and his back rigidly straight. Walking to Peasholm Park to drop off the ransom money would not be the first time he had placed himself in a dangerous situation. During the war, simply staying alive had been his ultimate priority. This situation felt rather similar in that he did not know where his enemy would attack from, or, indeed, if his foe would strike at all. Perhaps he would simply drop the money under the bench as instructed, walk away, the money would be collected, and Josephine would be returned. He fervently hoped that it would be that simple. He hurried upstairs to retrieve a small bag and his passport for identification at the bank. Tommy then walked into the centre of Scarborough and to the branch of the bank he used to withdraw the sum of money requested in the ransom note.
He amended his thoughts, not requested but demanded. This was not a person who was politely asking that he pay the money, but somebody insisting he must do so if he ever wanted to see his cousin's child alive again. Withdrawing the money was relatively simple. The bank staff knew him, as he had been staying in Scarborough for some weeks now, even though, quite correctly, he had taken his passport as proof. Despite eyebrows being raised at the sum of money Tommy requested, the staff hurried to fulfill his bidding. He looked at the clock on the wall of the bank as he left and wished it were already 3 o'clock. As it was, he had well over an hour to walk the short distance to Peaseholm Park before he was expected to slide the money under the bench next to the bandstand. Tommy decided he would walk to the park, find the bench, then stroll around and do his best to enjoy the scenery and the pleasant summer weather before it was time to leave the money and return to the hotel. When he reached the park, he made straight for the bandstand. To his dismay, he saw there was a bench on either side. Which one was the correct bench? He tried to remember if the letter had specified left or right, but of course he had not read the letter himself. Was it possible the police had made a mistake and not told him which bench had been specified in the letter? Or had they told him, but in his haste to hurry off and do the right thing, he had not listened to the instructions properly? Tommy ran a hand through his hair. He had been relieved when the police had said it was he who should deliver the ransom, because the note had been addressed to him. Now, he wished they had allowed Alexander Ryder or anyone else to carry out the task. If he chose the wrong bench, did that mean Josephine would not be returned? Was this some sort of game the kidnapper got enjoyment from? Was Josephine's captor watching him at that very moment, waiting for him to leave the money so they could take it, then sell Josephine to make an even larger fortune? He simply couldn't bear it. Nor could he think of any outcome other than the money being collected, getting back to the hotel, and finding that Josephine had been returned to her parents. Eventually, the clock in the church tower struck 3. Tommy checked his watch for what seemed like the 100th time to double-check the hour, then walked briskly towards the bench on the right. He sat down at the end nearest the bandstand, slid the holdall off his lap, then manoeuvred it with his foot so it rested underneath the bench as per the kidnapper's instructions. Forcing himself not to look around, he got back up and strolled towards the exit of the park. His spine prickled with every step he took, as though 1,000 watching eyes were boring into his back. His heart hammered so violently that it left him quite breathless. Tommy forced himself to walk more slowly and moderate his breathing. He had seen no one in the park whom he recognized. Of course, neither had he seen the police surveillance team that Detective Inspector Andrews assured him would watch at various vantage points throughout the park. In his mind's eye, he imagined a scene of great jubilation back at the hotel. Word would surely have been passed from the kidnapper to whoever was holding Josephine that the money had been paid, and the child would be back in her mother's arms where she belonged. Tommy held on to that vision as he walked. The return journey seemed so much longer as he rushed to get back to his family. As he entered the foyer, Tommy stopped as someone called out his name. He turned to the stairs and saw the maid, Nellie Gregory, descending. "Is there any news?" Tommy responded cautiously. "I've been out for a walk, so I don't know if anything has changed while I have been gone. I hope that whoever took Josephine has had an attack of conscience and returned her." "That is also my hope, Lord Northmore." Tommy watched as the maid walked towards the back of the hotel. He wanted to believe that her question and good wishes were exactly as they seemed, but he couldn't help but think that was naive on his part. Was it possibly a coincidence that Nellie just happened to be coming down the stairs as he returned to the hotel? "Oh, Tommy, you're back." Evelyn rushed to greet her husband. "Did it go well? Did you see the perpetrator? Was there a note left telling you where Josephine is?" He held up a hand. "It went as expected, except for one crucial aspect. Something went wrong? Alexander Ryder asked. Did the police mention a specific bench? Or do you remember if they mentioned one when the letter was read to us? Alexander shook his head. I'm certain they simply said the bench next to the bandstand. Yes, that's what I thought. Tommy raked a hand through his hair and walked over to the window. I don't understand, Evelyn said. Is there a problem? Tommy turned to face his wife. There was more than one bench. Next to the bandstand? Evelyn placed a hand on the small of her back and winced as though the movement caused her discomfort. There is a bench on either side of the bandstand, he explained. Alexander frowned. The letter didn't mention that. It simply said the bench next to the bandstand. That is what the police told us at any rate. Was one bench closer than the other? It was a reasonable question, but Tommy felt anger bubbling up through his body. I didn't waste time measuring them, but they both looked equal distance from the bandstand. Alexander nodded and did not seem to take any offence at Tommy's terse reply. What did you do? I chose the bench on the right and left the money underneath on the side nearest the bandstand. Why did you choose that bench? Evelyn asked. Tommy walked back over to his wife and put an arm around her shoulders. Please sit down, darling. You look rather uncomfortable. I'm fine. Despite her words, Evelyn took her seat. Now, please, answer the question. He shrugged. For no reason. Because it was on the right side, and therefore I hoped it was the right bench. I don't know. I didn't know what to do. That seems a reasonable assumption, Alexander said. Have you told the police you're back? Tommy strode back over to the window. I came straight in here. I hoped there would be news, but I can see that nothing has changed. The fiend who has Josephine has not brought her back. I shall go tell the police that you are back. Alexander walked out of the lounge. I suppose I'm rather a coward. Tommy turned his back to his family. I didn't want to go into the hotel manager's office and face David and Madeline and tell them I don't know if I did the correct thing. I don't know if the decision that I actually made was the right one or not. What if that is the difference between Josephine being returned or not? I shall not hear another word of this absolute nonsense, Aunt Em said sternly. You have done what was asked of you. You have taken the money out of the bank and placed it under the bench next to the bandstand. There is nothing more that you could have done. But what if... Aunt Em smacked her hand on the table in front of her. No more. Sit down, and I shall pour you a cup of tea. I simply couldn't drink a cup of tea. Tommy glanced around the room. I will, however, have a glass of brandy. As he walked over to the drinks tray in the corner of the room, the sound of crockery banging together with some force sounded through the cavernous space. Are you quite all right, dear? Aunt Em was facing Evelyn with a look of concern. Of course I am, Evelyn responded. I'm quite overwrought with worry about Josephine, and I'm afraid my hand trembled a little as I returned my teacup to the saucer. No harm done. Tommy watched as his wife dabbed at a small puddle of spilled tea on the table with her napkin. He poured a single measure of brandy and drank it in one greedy gulp. Taking a deep breath, he poured a double measure and walked back over to stand behind Evelyn. A member of the hotel staff walked into the lounge, and everyone turned to face him with eager expressions. There is a telephone call for Lady Emily Christie. Thank you. Aunt Em got to her feet. I assume there is somewhere private where I may take the call. Of course, my lady. The police are in the hotel manager's office, but there is a telephone in the administration office. I would be pleased to arrange for the staff to vacate that room while you take your call. That is most satisfactory. Aunt Em nodded her head in approval and left the room with the young man. Now hardly seems the time to be taking telephone calls, Tommy commented. Evelyn looked up at him, smiled and reached out a hand to him. This is not the first one she's taken today. though it is the first time I've heard her ask for privacy. She took several while you were gone. I rather think that Aunt Em is doing some sleuthing of her own." Tommy took his wife's hand and rested it on top of his shoulder. She gave it a little squeeze and then applied what could only be described as very firm pressure. Despite her assertion moments earlier that everything was all right, Tommy did not believe Evelyn. Something, other than Josephine being missing, was quite definitely not right with his wife. Chapter 7. Evelyn couldn't get comfortable. The chair didn't seem to support the bottom of her back properly, but somehow she was certain that if she lay down in bed, she would be no more comfortable. If things were no better in the next hour or so, she would certainly consult with Dr. Mannering and see if he had any ideas about what was causing the terrible ache in her back. Aunt Em came back into the lounge, her cheeks pink with excitement. "The police are rounding up our suspects and will be here momentarily." Evelyn frowned. "We are not ready." "Of course we are ready." Aunt Em smiled at Evelyn. "You should know by now that our family is rather like the Boy Scouts. We are always prepared and work together to fulfill our objectives." "I'm afraid I don't understand." Tommy frowned at his great-aunt. "No, my boy, perhaps you do not this time, but I do." The door opened and Detective Inspector Andrews and his junior colleague, Detective Sergeant Montgomery, entered the room. They brought with them Harold Williamson, Lady Caroline, Archibald, and Ruth Benson, together with Nellie Gregory. David Ryder followed with Madeline leaning heavily on his arm, her face a mask of anguish. "What happened with the money?" Tommy strode over to Detective Inspector Andrews. "Was it collected? Will Josephine be brought back to us?" The detective shook his head. "I'm afraid not. Whoever sent the note has not yet arrived to collect the money that you left."
"Oh, my goodness." Madeline held a hand up to her head. "That was our chance to get our darling girl back. If the money was not collected, then whatever will become of her?"
"The plain fact of the matter is, Mrs. Ryder, we simply do not know. We don't know why the money that was requested was not picked up. It makes little sense to us. Lord Northmore did everything that was asked of him." "That's not strictly true." Tommy paced to the window. "I didn't know where to leave the money." "We went through that before you left," the detective said. "You were to leave it underneath the bench next to the bandstand." "I know," Tommy said, "but what none of us knew is that there are 2 benches next to the bandstand, one on either side. I didn't know which bench the kidnapper meant." "So what did you do?" the detective asked. "You did leave the money." "Of course I left the money," Tommy snapped, his frustration getting the better of him and leaving his usual good manners absent. "I left it underneath the bench on the right, as near to the bandstand as possible without the bag protruding. We still have men there, watching. Perhaps the kidnapper will still turn up to collect it," the detective said doubtfully. "If he does, we'll have him." "The kidnapper cannot do that," Aunt Em said confidently, "because he's in this room. When I have finished explaining how I've used my powers of detection to ascertain his identity, he will then be arrested and taken away. Therefore, Detective Inspector Andrews, I suggest that you get in touch with your officers in the park and instruct them to retrieve Lord Northmore's money immediately." "In this room? I insist you tell me immediately who the culprit is." David Ryder stared at the suspects the police had brought into the lounge. Madeline sobbed quietly at his side. "All in good time," Aunt Em said. "Now, let us all get comfortable, because this may take some time." It was clear to everyone in the room that Aunt Em was enjoying herself immensely. Although Evelyn was certain she knew who had kidnapped Josephine, she could not be sure how they had done it. Neither was she sure precisely why. She knew the answer was money, of course. Except there must be more to it than that. The floor is yours, Lady Emily, the detective said. I know better than to interrupt when the Christie family is in full flow. Go ahead, do my job for me. I would never presume to do such a thing, Aunt Em said haughtily. You are a member of the police force of Yorkshire. I am Lady Emily Christie of Heslem. I am sure we can both agree that we are worlds apart. Evelyn hid a smile. Whether or not Aunt Em meant to insult the detective, she had just done so rather well. Let us start with the hotel manager, Harold Williamson. Aunt Em pierced the man with her fiercest gaze. Evelyn almost felt sorry for him. I don't know why I have been subjected to such vitriol from your family, he said. All I've done is try to ensure that your stay here at the Majestic has been enjoyable. Yet it seems your family has been determined to besmirch my character at every given opportunity. You have made it so very easy for us, Aunt Em commented. Your behaviour has been quite unbecoming of a gentleman. And let us be clear, a gentleman is what you are. The hotel manager took a seat and crossed his legs, resting his hands casually in his lap. If you say so, Lady Emily. Grace had mentioned that Mr. Williamson seemed very well educated, but that wasn't at all the same as being a gentleman. Evelyn wanted to jump in and question Aunt Em, but the indomitable older lady had already moved on. On the evening of the kidnap, you were otherwise engaged, driving Miss Mabel Benson back to her residence. Therefore, you could not have kidnapped Josephine. Unless, of course, you were working with an accomplice. You could have taken the child from her cot, handed her to someone else, and still taken Miss Benson home, therefore establishing a very solid alibi for yourself. Yes, I could have, the hotel manager agreed. However, you have absolutely no proof of that, and the reason you haven't is because I can tell you quite assuredly that it did not happen. What is this? Archibald Benson asked. Why are you saying that this fellow took my sister home? I understood from my wife that my sister was homesick for the country. What does that have to do with Mr. Williamson? That is true, dear, Ruth Benson said. Mr. Williamson kindly offered to drive Mabel home in his motor car. Wasn't that kind of him? I shouldn't have thought so, Archibald replied in a clipped tone. Mr. Williamson does not seem to me as the type of man to do anything for anyone else, unless there is something in it for him. Although Archie Benson had struck both her and Aunt Em as a rather reserved man, who was in complete control of his emotions, he was now showing them both that their initial views of his character did not tell the complete story. Mr. Benson had obviously taken the time to understand the hotel manager's character very clearly. Now, there is no call for you to speak about me in that way, sir. I think we both know there is every call, Aunt Em said quietly. I repeat what I said earlier. Your behaviour has fallen far short of what one would expect from a gentleman. Mr. and Mrs. Benson, let us now discuss your position as suspects in this matter. Aunt Em's words were spoken to distract Archie Benson. She did not want to speak any more about Mabel Benson's relationship with the hotel manager in front of the girl's brother, therefore keeping Miss Benson's dignity intact as much as possible. Us? Archibald Benson looked quite outraged. Why are we being dragged into this whole sorry mess? Forgive me, Mr. and Mrs. Ryder, I feel dreadfully sorry for you both, but I don't understand why your family is involving us in your misfortune. I agree with my husband, Ruth Benson said. All I have tried to do is my duty, as one woman to another. I refer to a particularly difficult conversation with Lady Northmore. I see no reason we should be punished for my honesty, but that is what it seems like to me. Aunt Em nodded. I understand that, and I must sincerely apologise for what I am going to say next,
as it may cause both of you great distress. That is not my intention. My desire is only to uncover the kidnapper of Josephine and the murderer of Elsie Warren. At first, we thought it was possible that your sister was involved in the kidnap of Josephine and had taken her back to your home for safekeeping. Why on earth would Mabel do such a thing? Mr. Benson's voice had risen from frustrated to barely contained anger. We may not live on a large country estate and enjoy the benefits of inherited titles, but we do live within the laws of England. I think I may know why, Ruth Benson said quietly. If I may, Lady Emily? Of course, Mrs. Benson. Aunt Em inclined her head. Of course, I was wholly unaware of what was to come, but with hindsight, I can see why I have become a suspect. I spoke to both Mrs. Ryder and the child's nanny on several occasions. I admit that I was completely captivated by Josephine, and had commented on how delightful she is many times. Now, what has that have to do with anything? Why must one be accused of kidnap just because they have admired somebody else's child? It is so much more than that, though, isn't it? Ruth Benson drew a handkerchief and held it over her face. Evelyn saw with great dismay that the other woman's shoulders were shaking. She wished there was something she could do to ease Mrs. Benson's distress. "See here," Archibald Benson addressed Detective Inspector Andrews. "You must stop this. You are allowing this woman to upset my wife." Ruth Benson wiped her eyes. "Don't you see, Archie? It isn't simply that I enjoyed spending a few moments with Josephine when I saw her. It's mostly because we do not have children of our own. That is right, isn't it, Lady Emily? Suspicion has fallen on us because we do not have children of our own." "That is a despicable suggestion." Archibald Benson's face had turned a horrible red. "I demand—" Aunt Em held up a hand. "Please do not upset yourself, Mr. Benson. Your wife is quite correct that, at first, we suspected you both for the reasons she has given. We knew also that both of you walked in Peasehelm Park, but at different times of the day. You never took a stroll together." Ruth Benson shrugged. "I walk an afternoon. I do so when we are at home, and so I have just carried on my habit in Scarborough. Of course, Archie is usually at work and is accustomed to rising very early, so he walks in the morning. I can see why that looks suspicious. You assumed that one of us was caring for the child, while the other was out walking." "That is correct," Aunt Em confirmed. "In addition, the ransom note that was left on the table next to the dead body of the child's nanny stated that the money for Josephine's safe return be left at a particular location in Peasehelm Park, the very place you both take your walks." "All circumstantial at best," Archibald Benson said. "I think I shall repeat what that awful chap over there said. You have no evidence of this happening, and the reason is that none of it occurred. My wife understands more than most what it is like to lose a child. And so the very last thing that she or I would ever do is cause another parent to also experience that pain." The words, delivered as they were in Mr. Benson's reserved and unemotional tone, were somehow so much more devastating. Tears pricked the back of Evelyn's eyes, and she wished she could reach out and empathize with Ruth Benson. But she did not think any comfort offered by her would be well received. The Bensons would want nothing to do with the Christie family once this was all over. In fact, she was certain they would pack up and leave Scarborough immediately. "I assume I am here because I had several conversations with your nanny about how jolly unfair it was that you have so much money as a family while I have so very little,"
Nellie Gregory said. Evelyn's respect for the hotel maid grew considerably. She had very clearly taken attention away from Mr. Benson's emotional words and the devastation on his wife's face by speaking up. Her voice shook during her quick speech, which hinted at how extremely nervous she must have been talking in front of so many people.
"That's right," Aunt Em said. "I understand you were quite uncomplimentary about the family." "Yes, I was," Nellie agreed. "In my defense, that was before I spoke to any of you. In my work here, I'm used to wealthy families, and mostly I remain an anonymous person, carrying out my duties in the background. Elsie was nice, and honestly, she spoke about you all as her employer in quite glowing terms. In return, I said how easy life was for people with money. Now, dear," Aunt Em said, "if you don't mind, please tell everyone what you told me earlier." Nellie cleared her throat. "I was actually looking for Lady Northmore, and saw you in the hotel foyer. I wanted to let you know it had occurred to me that there was something rather odd in Lady Caroline Merriweather's room." "Yes, indeed. And what was it?" "It was a cot." "Oh, for goodness sake," Lady Caroline said. "You know I asked for that to be placed in my room some days ago. I told you it was because I had received word that one of my daughters was to visit with their grandchild, and I wished to be prepared." "You must be an extremely conscientious great-grandmother," Aunt Em said to her friend. "I'm afraid I barely know one end of a baby from the other, and yet you are telling us that you were intending to care for your great-grandchild in your own room. The child's nanny left rather suddenly." Evelyn saw the words as the excuse that they were. Lady Caroline's cheeks were flushed with obvious embarrassment. "I suggest to you that your family has not engaged the services of a nanny for quite some time. Perhaps as long ago as when your daughters Violet and Iris were children. Don't be ridiculous." "Is it ridiculous? It may seem such a given that you are staying here at the Majestic. However, that is because your grandson allows you to stay here for free, isn't it?"
Evelyn held her breath. This was it. They were coming to the crux of the matter, and she believed the reason for Aunt Em's telephone calls that afternoon.
"I don't. Now, Caroline, there is no reason to be ashamed that your husband's unfortunate and extremely untimely death left your family in dire financial straits. I suspected that may have been the case when you refused to continue our friendship so many years ago. I regret that I did not push harder when you refused to see me and did not answer my letters. There's every reason. One should never speak of one's financial situation, it's rather crass. And I'm embarrassed that you are doing so now. You even go so far as to suggest I have a grandson that allows me to stay here? It's ludicrous." "It's not nonsense at all, is it, Mr. Williamson?" Even from across the room, Evelyn could see the hotel manager sweating. Oh, do stop babbling, Harold," Lady Caroline snapped. "You know how much I hate it when you do that." "I'm sorry, Granny." "She's his grandmother?" Detective Inspector Andrews asked. "That's correct," Aunt Em said. "I spent some time this afternoon telephoning to various friends and was able to find out that Lady Caroline's daughter Violet was married to a fellow named Williamson. I was certain that Harold Williamson was the person who had taken Josephine, and the fact he shared the same surname as Lady Caroline's daughter gave me the link that I needed. It was always clear to us that he must have had an accomplice. At first I thought it would be a young lady, as Mr. Williamson seems inordinately fond of every young woman staying at the hotel. But where is Josephine? Where is my baby?" Madeline cried. "Of course, dear, my sincere apologies. In uncovering these reprobates, I quite forgot how desperate you must be." Aunt Em looked towards Lady Caroline. "Where is the child?" "In my room." "By herself?" Madeline cried. "She wasn't, until the police forced me to come down here," Lady Caroline said. "She's been very well cared for, I assure you." Aunt Em turned to Nellie Gregory. "Mrs. Gregory, I wonder, would you mind taking Mr. and Mrs. Ryder together with one of the police officers upstairs to Lady Caroline's room?" Detective Sergeant Montgomery looked at his superior officer for permission before leaving the room with David, Madeline, and Nellie. "If you were so desperate for the money, why didn't you turn up to collect the ransom?" Tommy asked. Harold Williamson dropped his head and looked forlornly at the carpet in front of him. "There was a mistake. Things were not supposed to happen like that. It was a dreadful mistake." "A mistake for which you will swing," Lady Caroline said with absolutely no empathy for her grandson. "You should never have killed that girl. No one was supposed to get hurt." "She wouldn't do as she was told." Harold looked up at his grandmother momentarily, his eyes wild. "All she had to do was give the Northmores the ransom note and tell them that she had forgotten to give it to them earlier. She refused. She said she thought they already suspected her story." "We did," Evelyn said. "It all just seemed wrong. The room, Elsie outside on the balcony, the forced entry through the patio doors. However, would anyone have got up to the balcony and then broken in? So you killed her? You killed her just because she would not give us the note?" Tommy asked. "She was ruining everything." "No," Lady Caroline shouted. "You ruined everything. You could have put the note in an envelope and said it had been delivered to the hotel. Or you could have left it somewhere in the hotel for either the family or a member of staff to find. We didn't need that girl to hand it to Lord Northmore." "That was the plan. You said we had to follow the plan." "The ransom money," Tommy repeated. "I still don't see why you didn't collect it." "I panicked after I killed Elsie and dared not leave the hotel." Evelyn put a hand on her stomach as yet another pain radiated from the bottom of her back across her abdomen. She might not have any experience of what was happening with her body, but she was becoming more certain as each minute passed that this was not simple discomfort. "Arrest these people." Aunt Em gave an extravagant wave of her arm. "And take them away. I should also throw away the key if I were you. No one will miss them." Evelyn hid a chuckle at Aunt Em's dramatics. Detective Inspector Andrews opened the door and beckoned two uniformed officers inside, then gave them instructions to arrest Harold Williamson and Lady Caroline Merriweather. "Darling," Evelyn gestured to Tommy, who hurried to her side. She pulled the sleeve of his jacket so that he lowered his head to hers. "I think it may be time for dear Teddy to be more than just a friend to this family." "Do you mean—" Tommy's face took on an expression that was somewhere between horror, excitement, and trepidation. "Is it time? Is it finally time?" "Yes," Evelyn confirmed. "I believe it's very nearly time for us to meet our child." Epilogue. I walked into the room, aware that something like this simply shouldn't happen, but nevertheless glad that Tommy and Evelyn had, again, broken protocol and thrown societal norms out of the window. Evelyn sat up in bed cradling her new baby, who was wrapped in a white crocheted shawl I knew she had made herself. As I edged nearer to the bed, Tommy stepped forward. "Come along, Aunt Em. Hurry and come closer and meet your great-great-grandniece." "Less of the greats," I said, more out of habit rather than because I felt any real umbrage. If they let me hold their precious bundle, they could call me whatever they liked. "Aunt Em," Evelyn said, her face a picture of radiant joy, "we would like you to meet Lady Isabel Harriet Emily Christie." "Oh," I said, my voice cracking.
I pressed my lips together and gave myself a moment before I tried again. It's an extremely lovely name, but I wonder, does she really need all three of them? Yes, Tommy looked at Evelyn, and they shared a tender smile over the child's head. She does. Pull up that chair, Tommy, Evelyn instructed. Yes, that's it. Put it right next to the bed, so your aunt can sit down. I'm not so old that I need to sit down all the time, my dear, I said dryly. I thought you might like to sit down so you can hold Isabel. Oh, I said again, the word as ineffectual as it had been the first time. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Not even a very pleased squeak or an astonished gasp of pure happiness. Blinking rapidly, I sat in the chair and held out my arms. I should like that very much. Tommy placed his newborn daughter in my waiting arms, and I stared into her precious little face. They had waited so long for this moment, I had feared that it would never happen for the couple that I surely loved as dearly as the children I had never been blessed with. Isabel had dark blue eyes that stared up at me with open curiosity. They were fringed with dark, spiky lashes. Her cheeks were pink, her lips a perfect rosebud, and she had the sweetest little button nose. Hello, I said, as soon as I could trust that my voice would come out sounding mostly like my own. I am your Aunt Em, and I must tell you that you are indeed blessed to be born to such wonderful parents. Now you are here, I am certain they will raise you with all the love and care that you deserve. They most definitely will not be mixing themselves up with sleuthing and such like. Most assuredly, they will leave that to me in the future. Now, Aunt Em. No, Tommy, Evelyn said gently. We have discussed this. Your aunt is right. Solving murders is not for us anymore. Our priorities are, and will remain, with our child. Aunt Em ably stepped into both of our shoes today, and we should allow her to do so again, should the need arise. It's perfectly possible we will never come across another murder as long as we all shall live, I said. But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. For one reason or another, murder seemed to have a way of finding us. Tommy laughed. Do you really think so, Aunt Em? I raised an eyebrow at him. I do not. He looked at Evelyn imploringly, but her countenance was reproachful to say the least. No, Tommy, never again. Oh, Evelyn. I shook my head as darling Isabel closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep. You should know better than that. One never, ever says never, dear. Author's note. Although it did not start out this way, I have written this story in loving memory of my beautiful niece, who was born sleeping on the 24th of August, 2023. You are loved, Isabel Harper McKenna, and while you live on in our hearts, your name will also live on in the pages of the stories I write. You have been listening to Murder at the Seaside, a 1920s Cosy Mystery, a Tommy and Evelyn Christie mystery, Book 8, written by Catherine Coles, narrated by Alex Lee. Copyright 2024 by Inspired Press Limited. Production copyright by Inspired Press Limited.